It's Wednesday, it's 11:15 and we're live in Westminster as Rachel Reeves prepares to deliver a crucial economic statement. This is the scene in Downing Street. We're expecting the Chancellor to emerge from number 11 in the next few minutes. We've learned overnight she'll have to make £500 million worth of further cuts to welfare, and there'll be a squeeze on departmental spending. But the Chancellor will insist that she is delivering stability in a changing world with a £2 billion boost to defence spending. We'll bring you the Chancellor's statement live at 12:30, plus expert analysis here in the studio.
And I'm here in Burnley talking to local businesses and people on the market about what they want from the Chancellor.
Joining us today, Labour MP Helena Dollymore, Conservative MP and former Work and Pensions Secretary Esther McVey, our economics editor Faisal Islam and our political editor Chris Mason. This is Politics Live. Hello, yes, it's Spring Statement Day, an occasion for the Chancellor Rachel Reeves to update us on the state of the economy and her plans going forward, with forecasts from the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility. It has grown from a forecast into a statement today and taken on greater significance as a result, partly because of a gloomy economic backdrop, the prospect of growth, remember the government's core mission being downgraded, and Rachel Reeves's commitment to stick to her non-negotiable fiscal rules. More of that in a few minutes' time. Now, the government says that the world has changed, and you'll hear a lot about that from Rachel Reeves, and that has changed the numbers, so it's harder to make them add up. Today, though, is also a verdict on Rachel Reeves herself, her own judgment and her domestic economic plans so far. So my opening question to the panel, starting with you, Helena, is it global uncertainty or the way the government's been running the economy that has got us here?
Well, today's statement is about securing Britain's future in a really uncertain world. It builds on the budget, which was all about bringing the stability our economy needed after 14 years of economic chaos and mismanagement under the Tories, and providing that injection into our public services that desperately needed it. More money for the NHS, which we're already seeing the results of, waiting lists falling, more money in people's pockets with the national minimum wage going up next month. Today is about continuing that, taking the decisions we need to stabilise the economy and make sure we get that desperately needed growth.
Esther, is it global uncertainty or the way the government's running the economy and making choices of their own?
Well, there is global uncertainty coming. I think we can add that into the mix, of course. But actually what has happened, and the main reason for this drop in growth, was the budget in October. I think it showed how woefully ill-prepared Rachel Reeves was, how poor she's been as a Chancellor. I don't think she had the knowledge that she needed. So you went from somebody like Rishi Sunak, who had a wealth of experience, was bringing inflation down, was getting things under control, to really Rachel Reeves, who said growth is the #1 mission, and she did everything to destroy growth. Those extra taxes on businesses, fundamentally what I'm hearing now, that national insurance increase for employers has been a devastating blow, and that is the pain the country is feeling. And only she, it seems, didn't know that by taxing businesses like this, she was going to crush the economy.
Again, we are hearing absolutely no apology or contrition from the Conservatives about the mess that they left us, the worst inheritance of any government. Yes, we made some tough decisions in the budget, but we did that in a way that was fair. With businesses, we protected the smallest businesses. There are more small businesses out there that will pay less or no national insurance as a result of raising the employment allowance that they benefit from, something the Tories could have done in 14 years and did not do.
Can I just give you a little bit? No, I'll give it now as well. A bit of Ronnie Reel for the businesses who are coming to me. So I've got family businesses. Some of them have been around since 1829. And do you know what they said to me, Esther? This budget is so bad. We survived 2 world wars. We've survived the Spanish flu, and we survived COVID lockdown. Rachel Reeves' budget will kill us.
Businesses,
no, I'm hearing from
struggling after 14 years of public services on their knees. They've got employees waiting on sick lists. Look, and actually what they need is the investment in our economy to get the
Helena,
economy growing
I will
again.
say you're doing exactly what Rachel Reeves is doing. You're giving some sort of academic, highfalutin, whatever.
200,000 jobs created since the election.
Please,
under
let
this
me
government.
finish. This isn't true. You've got now the biggest collapse in businesses since Labour was last in power with the financial crash. And those that are still surviving, 30%, say they're going to be contracting their workforce.
Let's take a pause there, and let's bring in
honestly,
Faisal Islam and Chris Mason,
you
because we have seen clearly demonstrated here the contrasting views. I mean, unsurprisingly, you've got the government and the opposition, but a very different view of what's brought us to this particular point and the difficult choices that the Chancellor is going to make. Do you think it is down to global uncertainty more than it is to the sorts of choices that we've heard both from Helena and Esther?
So growth is clearly proving elusive right now, and the question that's open about the OBR forecast, and that's the centrepiece of what we're going to hear today, is less about a series of measures and more about the grand strategy and macroeconomics. Whether that sort of flows through to the end of the Parliament is the key question in terms of her room for manoeuvre. What's really driving the tightness in the public finances and the need to make a course correction, she would not have wanted to have made these changes to the budget plans, is actually probably the global interest rates that have gone up. And yes, the US interest rates have gone up and the European ones have gone up for all governments, and the UK has been caught up in that. But intriguingly, we went up with the US, and then when the US started to fall, we started to go up and being treated like we're European, and we're going to have to spend billions to rearm. So there's something specific about the UK and those markets. There's a danger we get the worst of both worlds, when actually, and we'll talk about it later, there is a big opportunity to map out for the UK economy something a bit more positive about our place in the world.
So there are reasons to be cheerful.
I mean, there's the smallest of shoots in terms of the service economy and where things might go. But right now, growth isn't there, and that is what is causing this problem and dilemma.
I mean, there is global uncertainty, of course there is, but when we go to look at some of the figures, particularly on growth, this was already happening before Donald Trump, for instance, came to the White House, and the government came in July promising to have growth in the economy, not cut spending and not increase taxes.
Yeah, and then there's the choices that the Chancellor made in the autumn, and a couple of key ones, elements of which we'll see play out today. So firstly is the self-imposed so-called fiscal rules that the Chancellor has imposed upon herself. Now, the argument that they make is that is rational, that it is rational to demonstrate a sense of economic credibility, and then to be very aware of the role that the Office for Budget Responsibility can play, in their view, in enhancing that. But it was also a choice from the Chancellor back in the autumn to set her spending around that as tight as she did to those particular rules, where back in the autumn, depending on your reading of the runes and the betting markets and all the rest of it, it was probably a coin toss that Donald Trump would become the next president, maybe more likely than that, with the prospect that things could be up in the air in all sorts of directions as a result, which means there was, it seems to me, a relatively high likelihood back in the autumn that a scenario like this could play out in one where the Chancellor would then have to come back and sort of revisit. Well,
in terms of revisiting, we did learn overnight that, in fact, Rachel Reeves and the government's going to have to find a further 500 million, £500 million from welfare. Why?
So this is where we've seen the what goes on within the Treasury playing out to a greater extent in public than might otherwise have been the case because of the sequencing of announcements. So we got that announcement last week, didn't we, on benefits and on welfare, and we're crucially going to get the impact assessment to come in a couple of hours' time. The government last week, very strikingly, while saying we can't give you the impact assessment because we have to wait for the publication from the Office for Budget Responsibility, did hang a big figure on their savings. They suggested it would save £5 billion. We now learn that the Office for Budget Responsibility is going to say that it would save £3.4 billion. In other words, save considerably less than they thought. And hence we expect the Chancellor to come back and say, well, we're going to try and at least bridge some of that gap by some additional squeezes on an element of universal credit.
Well, and there are protests going on outside Downing Street, just at the gates, really, as you enter, from disability campaigners. Because, Helena, they were already upset, worried, distressed on behalf of disabled people, vulnerable in society, who need and rely on those benefits. I mean, how comfortable are you personally with the idea that many disabled people will have less money. I mean, a Labour MP, unnamed, did say it's not cheaper today than it was a few years ago to be on benefits and disabled.
Well, what we've set out in the reforms is that those who have lifelong conditions that can never work will actually get an additional premium under these reforms.
But others
and we'll have
lose.
an end to the reassessments that have been so horrible for
and
so
you're
many
comfortable
people.
with that?
But the system we've got at the moment is completely broken. It's a system that we've inherited from the Tories. Esther herself was a minister in work and pensions that presided over this broken system, where we have the rise going up in such an unsustainable way that if it continues at this current rate, the system will not exist for those very people that you described, Joe, who need it the most.
So you think there are quite a sizable number of people claiming benefits who don't need them?
We've got to reform the system.
But answer that question. Do you think that's
true? For those who need it the most, to protect those who can never work. And we've got to make sure we get the right support for those who can work, but currently are stuck on benefits because the system says to you, we're writing you off and we're not going to give you support. £1 billion last week for extra support to get people into work, to give them that support to get them into work, alongside the reforms like more money to tackle NHS waiting lists. We know many people are stuck on waiting lists. They're on benefits as a result.
Yes.
Benefits are losing. Businesses are losing out as a result of having their employees on those lists.
Well, let me put that broad principle to Esther McVey, because I presume, Esther, there's nothing that you will disagree with when it comes to a moral mission to get more people off benefits and back into work. And there isn't anything you would disagree with trying to reform a system if it means £5 billion worth of savings can be made.
Shall I tell you why this is doomed to failure? Is because this was just finding money to make sure that Rachel Reeves met the demands of the OBR. This wasn't...
So you don't think that money's there?
Let me finish my sentence.
Yeah.
So when the Conservative and the Coalition came into power, Ian Duncan-Smith and Lord Floyd had been working on benefit changes for 3 years to change the system. And with it, they thought, how are we going to do the training and support? And fundamentally, how are we going to build up the economy so the jobs are there for people to go into? You cannot take people off benefits. Well, and it did do very well because actually we got record rates of employment. 1,000 more people each and every day were going into work.
Rachel Reeves. You can just see Rachel Reeves, hang on, leaving number 11. She's on her way to the Commons. You'll hear journalists no doubt throwing her questions on her way to the Commons because we have Prime Minister's questions coming up at midday, and then she will stand and deliver her statement at the dispatch box at 12:30. Interesting that you mentioned Ian Duncan-Smith, who, as you say, worked for years creating the universal credit. He also resigned. He quit over attempts by George Osborne, the then Chancellor, to take out billions worth from welfare because he said it couldn't be done.
And you do know I brought those billions back, 4.5 billion, when I was Secretary of State. So there is an element of adjusting there. But let me get this right. Rachel Reeves has not only destroyed the jobs for these people to go into, she has also
200,000 more jobs.
It's all right. It's all right. You finish.
Interrupting, because really you don't understand the benefit system, and it's blindingly obvious you don't, because we got record rates of people into work. We also brought youth unemployment down, which actually Labour had delivered at a very high record, and we got record numbers of women into work. And that's because we were growing the economy at the same time. What you've seen from Rachel Reeves...
Well, you weren't growing it that much, Esther, during those years. It was pretty anaemic. And actually, just to come back on one thing...
Let me say, when you get record rates of people into work, that was young people, that was women, that was everybody, that is also 1,000 more people each and every day. And that is what we delivered. Now, where it went wrong, and I will totally agree with this, is lockdown and what happened with COVID and lockdown, and then you saw things going unravelling.
From which Conservative governments did never recover.
Yeah, and everybody...
But let me let Helena respond.
And everybody voted for lockdowns, I think, except me. There was only a couple of people who didn't vote for lockdowns.
I don't think you were the only one.
No,
but anyway, Helena, let's just pick up...
Esther and other Conservatives presided over has created these completely flawed incentives in the system where if you are deemed incapable of work, there is no ability for you to even try work. You risk, if you take a job to try it on 1 day a week, you risk completely losing your benefits. We're scrapping that. On universal credit, we're going to have the first ever above inflation increase.
Esther, hang on.
But you're wrong.
But the record of your government is very clear, Esther. 1 in 8 young people in my constituency not in education, training or employment. I have had parents coming to my surgery furious that their young people have been signed off for years when they want them to get mental health support to get them back into the job.
I'm going to ask you
That's
you
the
to
legacy.
take a little breather while I come
Because
over to
Helen
this
has
side of the
something
studio.
nonsense.
Now, hang on.
The record is quite
Hang
clear.
on, just hold your fire. We'll come back to you both in just a moment. Because if we go back to the beginning, as they say, I did say in the introduction that this is usually a forecast, but it's grown into a statement. Why?
Because of that sort of miss in terms of the Chancellor's self-imposed fiscal rules, because of the slower growth, because of the rise in interest costs, it's squeezed out spending, it's eradicated that room for manoeuvre. I think we can show the growth where it was due to go, if you believe the budget from the budget forecast from the OBR. That's it, you know, not spectacular growth, but reasonable growth over the next 4 years. This is where the Bank of England, for example, think that the reality of the situation is now considerably lower, I think, as we can see in the next slide, which is coming.
Yes, we can just show the Bank of England for here.
Yes, OK, fine. So, and so we think that the OBR is going to do something like this, potentially that 2% coming down to 1%, perhaps a similar thing in 2026. And the question really is what happens in the last few years, because it's judged over 5 years. So the fact that growth has been slower, Esther puts that down to national insurance, it can kind of wash out and not be the principal factor here. So what we don't know is what happens in 28, 29. And they sometimes say it's going to grow more in the final few years. So that's a key judgment. The borrowing costs, so we can see a chart on that showing that under Jeremy Hunt's budget a year ago, it was due to the total borrowing was due to be 87 billion per year. That was up to 127 at the budget. And we think if you look at all the data that's coming month to month, that will be up to 151 billion. Again, that's in this year, and similar things happening in the next few years, adding to the borrowing before there's this change, this cut in both welfare and potentially in departmental spending. And also a sort of accounting thing where the shift from aid to defence helps you because you exempt capital spending. That's deep down in the sort of public accounting textbooks, but maybe a bigger factor than I think I have appreciated. So then there's this question about how close to the wind chancellors tend to sail at these events. So this is the room for manoeuvre. And I think we can see here that's fairly significant under Rishi Sunak immediately after the pandemic. It kind of gets cut back a bit. Jeremy Hunt in his budget a year ago, that's really tight. Ahead of the election, perhaps, wants to kind of spend as much as you can. And then Rachel Reeves, she had a bit of a bonus. It went up, but then they essentially spent it and it brought it back down to 10 billion. 50-50 chance of being met. It wouldn't have been met were it not. And that's what's motivating today's policy action, which has taken it from being a spring forecast solely to being a statement with some actions, albeit not huge, no tax rises, things like that, relatively modest.
I mean, Chris, if the world has changed, if we know it has changed, but if we believe Rachel Reeves that is the real reason for having to make the numbers add up in a different way, why not change the rules?
Well, and that's a debate that we see playing out both publicly and privately, because comparisons can be made, for instance, with Germany, which recently has shaken up its rules to allow a significant increase in defence spending. The counter-argument you hear from the government is that the level of national debt in the UK is considerably higher as a share of the economy, that you would pile more onto borrowing costs. It's interesting, though, because you hear the argument from both the left and the right of the Labour Party, at least posing that question. A couple of other things you could throw into the mix would be, and again, it's a question around how much has the world changed, and therefore the extent to which those in government think that would justify them taking a very different course of action from one that they were defending 6 months ago and are defending now. So could they find themselves having to look at the big taxes, the things that they promised in their manifesto that they wouldn't? And obviously that's one heck of a political hurdle to overcome: income tax, national insurance, and VAT. You get other people on the right of politics who will make an argument that says you've gone nowhere near far enough with welfare and with benefits, and that what we heard last week was merely slowing down the rate of increase, not cutting. And if you are having a debate about the world changing and our defence posture shifting in the next decade to a much more significant one in terms of defence spending, then you're going to have, so the argument goes, have some really tough questions about the reprioritisation of public spending.
I mean, what are the pressures on Rachel Reeves? There's her own integrity, her own commitment to non-negotiable rules, and she thinks that's important to the markets, in part. But there is also an issue from within the Labour Party itself. We had David Blunkett, former Cabinet Minister, sitting here where Helena is sitting, saying, look, you can make an argument to make a special case, to have an exemption, particularly with defence spending going up and so on. But she isn't going to change them.
No, not here. I mean, I think it's important to get a sense of scale. When a G7 partner, Europe's biggest economy like Germany, does something that it's done, and its fiscal rules are even more hardcore than ours. They're hardwired into the constitution of Germany. They're going to change the constitution of Germany in order to borrow up to €1 trillion more over 10 years, half of which going into defence, half of which going into infrastructure. Now, that does set a different baseline and expectation when you're facing very tough decisions, I think, for MPs. People might be asking the question. The counter-argument is, as you say, you would just end up paying more in interest costs. But essentially what we're saying is the world has changed, but not that much. Not enough to, for example, want to spend... we could match Russian levels of defence spending, about $100 billion a year. We're at about 75. If you want to do that, you might have to change this. I don't think this argument's going to go away because it's an argument not just about defence. If the world really has changed as much, you're asking fundamental questions about the size of the state. Essentially the welfare state and the health spending in the UK was built up as we got the peace dividend when defence spending went down. If it's going to go up to 3% or even higher, these are huge sums of money. And are we really addressing that really more significant question?
Well, just before we talk a little bit more about growth, Helena, you used to work for Save the Children, and the government has already announced cutting the international aid budget to pay for increased spending in defence to reach 2.5% by 2027. Again, was that a trade-off that you were comfortable with?
I think we have to adjust to the world that faces us, and we've got a much more uncertain world than even when we came in July.
Taking it from international aid
Things are getting
was the right
very
place.
scary in the world today, and we have to find the money to fund the country's security, which is the first priority of any government. It's also really important because we know it's going to drive growth in our economy too. The extra money for defence is going to create jobs in every corner of the UK, and it's only right that the government acts responsibly.
Well, you say it's going to drive growth. Let's have a look at the evidence so far. If we have a look at last year's growth forecast, Faisal, take us through that.
Yeah, so that's the first half. Obviously the Conservatives point to the fact that that was rather rosy in the first half, and then it's basically flat in the second half. That 0.8 is flattered by the rebound from what was a recession in the couple of quarters before that, but there is a pattern there, and I think privately there is an admission that perhaps some of the sort of dour narrative about and pessimism, notwithstanding the fact that tough decisions may have been needed, still the sort of general vibe around the economy was pretty negative at the end of last year, and perhaps overly so. And we saw a distinct change of tone from the government and from Downing Street in January, where they were really talking up growth here, there and everywhere with lots of sort of mini policies. So that is the rough pattern. I think if we look at the next chart, it shows that in comparison, so this is OECD, one set of forecasts, shows that the UK may nonetheless, with sort of moderate levels of growth, do OK. Huge amounts of uncertainty here. We've got the Trump tariff trade issues. There's a possibility we might get a deal on that before so-called Liberation Day from the White House next week. And then there's sort of big questions here. As I suggested before, there is a route through this utter turmoil where the UK could have trade connections with the US, could get a better deal with the EU, still connected to China, getting investment from the Gulf. It's a tough ask. It's tricky diplomatically. It's kind of, I don't know, it's like sort of geopolitical twister, trying to kind of like basically reach out in all different directions. But that is the sort of path that they may be going at, but I kind of don't hear much about that strategy.
Well, before I come to you, Esther, just broadly in terms of Rachel Reeves herself, how big is it for her personally today?
It's big. It's really big because, whatever you call today, and there's been the various iterations of labels, both from the government and the Conservatives planning it an emergency budget, etc., it is a moment. It is a moment where the Chancellor is front and centre, and it's a moment where Parliament and the country have at least a fleeting moment of taking a judgment on whether or not the pitch that the government is offering is one that they have faith in. So in that sense, it's undeniably a moment. It has got bigger as a result of a combination of those international factors and her own decisions, and therefore turned into something more than she would have anticipated, which means it's also a bigger moment than she'd hoped it would be.
I mean, Esther, in terms of the increases in defence spending, presumably you support that in terms of the challenges facing the world and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Where would a Conservative government have found the money to pay for first 2.5%, coming in a few years earlier than the Conservatives said they would bring it in, and then by 2033, I think, up to 3%?
Well, I'm glad Labour's now agreeing that foreign aid was something that needed to be cut to go into defence, because obviously they've railed against it for years and years and years.
It was a Conservative Prime Minister who brought it to 0.7 and said
that's
it should
right,
be...
and then also Rishi took it down to 0.5%. I would have taken it less. I do believe that charity begins at home and you need to pay for what you've got at home. And then there were things like GB Energy. We wouldn't have created that. There's things like the £9 billion for public sector pay with no productivity link. So we wouldn't have done any of that. Some of the money would have come from there. But I think it's going to be a bad day for Rachel Reeves, because really she's boxed in now between cuts and taxes, but she says she can't tax because there's certainly no growth, and a Conservative government would, as you were saying, would have been looking for growth. And things are going to get...
She's looking for growth.
But things are going to get worse for Rachel Reeves.
Why?
Because Nick and some of these taxes don't kick in until April. It's going to get worse and worse and worse. Businesses say to me, we want certainty.
No, I've heard.
And after the budget...
Well, they're going to get certainty.
They're not going to get certainty now with this spring statement. There's going to be worse and worse, and it's going to get gloomier. And when we talk about youth unemployment, the thresholds for that national insurance contribution increase come down from 9,100 to 5,000, which actually will make youth unemployment go through the roof.
But what would a Conservative government in this position have done? Would you have increased borrowing? Would you have blown the fiscal rule self-imposed, yes, admittedly by Rachel Reeves herself? Would you have cut much more in spending and had austerity again, or would you have increased taxes after already putting them up to the highest level?
Can I say, which we were bringing down, we did put them up, but we bring down. Well, can I say we wouldn't be in this position because we wouldn't have brought in those billions of pounds of wasted expenditure, and we wouldn't have brought in those tax increases, which is basically killing off the growth in your society as you crush business. But I'm afraid they're not understanding
Esther,
that.
It's not just Esther saying that. It is the government, it's not just businesses either, it's the government's own analysis that says it's going to cost £5 billion more to businesses. It is going to have a negative impact. Now, further down the line, it may change, but it is going to do that. Do you accept that?
It's a tough measure to take, but we've done it in a way that protects the smallest businesses. And what I hear from businesses is actually that they are struggling because of our broken public services. They've got employees stuck on sick leave, on NHS waiting lists. I'm not hearing from Esther what they would have done to pay for the record injection of 26 billion into the NHS. Waiting lists have fallen 5 months in a row. We ended the junior doctors' strike. I completely defend giving public sector workers the pay rise that they deserved to get our public services back on their feet.
All right.
Under Esther's government, none of it would have happened, and I'm not hearing any answers as to how they would fix the broken public services.
Well, if you have any questions about the Chancellor's statement today, then you can get in touch via your voice, your BBC News, using the WhatsApp number on the screen or via the BBC website at the address shown below. And also hearing about people's views on the statement today is Jim Connolly, who's in Burnley. Welcome, Jim.
Hi there, Joe. Yeah, welcome along to Burnley Market. It's a small mill town nestled up in the Pennines, and it's really a good place to get a sense of what people are thinking when it comes to today's big economic news and what it means for them and their pocket. We've chosen Burnley because politically it's an interesting place. It's been traditionally a very Labour stronghold, but it swung to the Conservatives during the fall of the Red Wall. The Lib Dems have done well here in the past, and Reform too will be eyeing up this kind of place in upcoming local elections. So politically interesting, but economically interesting too. It's got high levels of social deprivation. It's in the top 10 when it comes to universal credit claimants, and also when it comes to the most deprived council areas in the country. So today's talk of benefit cuts will mean a lot to people here. And to get a sense of just how much those benefits will mean, those cuts, and what it means for people that need those benefits, we've got Jess here. Jess, You're a worker, a crisis worker here in the city, in the town. Tell me, how much of an issue is the benefit cuts for the people that you work with?
Oh, I've been feeling this since November, since the winter fuel grant cut. I've had a lot of pensioners come in, and obviously since a lot of the stuff about PIP being online, all I have had inundated people coming in to ask me what changes they're going to be, when they're going to be, how it's going to affect them and the benefits, and there is a lot of panic.
It's interesting because often talk of announcements down at Westminster don't cut through 230 miles away, but you're saying it's having a real tangible effect for people and instilling quite a bit of anxiety by the sound of it.
Yeah, completely. Like I say, I have people just walking in off the street, just coming in to say, can I have a bit of advice? And straight away I know what it's going to be. I know it's the disability benefits that are changing. I know there's a big, massive change with the migration to universal credit at the same time. So there's a lot of changes at the same time, it's the change that is panicking people. I do believe people will adapt very well, but it's just getting to that point, and obviously I'm here to answer them questions if I can answer them.
What will you be looking for from the Chancellor today for the people that you work with?
Basically, I would love it if the change did take place, but it was easier for people to access services along the way, and of the support being put in place to explain to people what is going on, when it's going to happen, and what these changes are going to mean to them.
Rowley, you run a big business here. You're a large manufacturer. Tell us a bit about your business and what it is you want from the Chancellor today.
So we're, Panaz, we're a fabric manufacturer based out of Burnley, but we're operating globally. We ship to 60 countries around the world on an annual basis, offices all over the world. And as far as we're concerned, it's been a struggle, I think, for a lot of businesses in our sector, our customers within hospitality, within the healthcare world, and particularly after the autumn budget, where things started, before that, things started to look up, and that really put people on the back foot coming into this financial year. So that's where we are at the moment, and I'm hoping for a bit better or revision maybe on some of the policies that we saw there.
The big thing that the Chancellor keeps talking about is the need for growth. She keeps talking about that's what's going to get us out of all our problems, is the country's going to start growing. How do we do that from your perspective as a business owner?
Absolutely. Well, I think the first thing not to do is put in a load of inflationary measures that are going to have an impact on interest rates. We've seen that pull through into our industry through a reduction in investment. You see that through decreased changing hand of hotels and investment in that way. So the government, what they need to do is they need to start talking to businesses and engaging with businesses about how they can support them to grow through domestic growth, but also through exporting. Exporting is so important. It's always been one of the linchpins of the UK economy, and it's something following Brexit and the erosion of the last 5 years that's starting to fall behind.
That's interesting that's a big business there, but coming across here, we've got a restaurant here in the market. Rupali, you run this place. How's life here for you? Are you struggling? Is it difficult, or are you thriving at the minute?
It's been getting harder and harder. I've had to let go of a staff, although it's a small business, but having let go of one staff makes a difference because, I can't afford that staff. But then that impacts on me. But when I started 2 years ago, I thought I would make a reasonable wage to sustain my family, but I can't, and I left education for that. But it's been getting harder and harder.
What do you want from the Chancellor today?
I want the Chancellor to think about people in this area, who are really struggling. I mean, we're Lancashire, we're northern towns, we're not known for having the best of the wealth, so our communities haven't got great amount of money to spend, but that impacts on us as businesses because we can. And if you look at the price of food now going up and up, people are making choices whether to eat in or out.
Well, Joe, we're going to throw it back to you. Obviously, lunch is sorted here. We're going to be heading to this cafe in a minute. But you can get a real sense of how people here in this town are really struggling.
Well, I'm glad you're getting food shortly. Everyone here in the studio will have to wait just a little bit longer, and I'm not sure I'm supplying it anyway. But, Chris, just to go back to last year, picking up on some of the things we heard from the people that Jim was talking to, was there a sense, and is there a sense now a little bit of regret by the government when they came in July of being as gloomy as they themselves admitted they were. They said they had to be. The inheritance was terrible from the Conservatives. But in a way, the confidence that Esther was talking about too sort of started to sort of leach then.
Yeah, I mean, when you unpack it, it was very striking speaking to people new in government last summer. They made a claim and they said that this was a kind of authentic surprise about the scale of what they claimed was the mess they inherited. There's obviously a big argument since about the extent to which the claims of the black hole and all the rest of it are reasonable or not. It is also definitely true. I've just been reminding myself of some of the key quotes of the doom-laden vocabulary from the Prime Minister and others in the early months. There was a news conference at the end of August in the Downing Street Garden. The message said the Prime Minister will be difficult to hear. It's going to be painful. The budget will be difficult. And that was then something of a mantra. Now, they were saying that that was trying to lay the ground for their attempts to patch the economy back.
Yeah, the fundamentals.
But I think there was an acknowledgement privately from quite a few that the collective assembly of those arguments by a lot of senior folk ended up giving a rather doomy and gloomy impression. And what is definitely the case, Faisal was nodding to this 10, 15 minutes ago, is that particularly since Christmas, there's been a notable shift in tone and trying to sound a bit more sunny. And a key thing that we'll get from the Chancellor in 45 minutes or so is hooking, if you like, that sense of a more positive economic future to the defence spending. So an attempt to even geographically point to various places around the UK where defence spending will go, and they'll make a geopolitical argument about the necessity of that, but also a local economy argument about, you know, well-paid, highly skilled jobs in a sector that the UK wants to put a lot more money into.
Right. I mean, we heard there from people in Burnley, a big business owner, and the woman who runs the restaurant there. And you've spoken to businesses too. But the other side, which Helena has referred to, is that the government would argue that they won, and they won big, partly as a result of promising to fix public services, and there was investment into the NHS. Do you accept that that is what many people did vote for?
Well, they wanted money to go into the NHS, but they wanted it linked to productivity and reform. And straight away, we've also heard that some of the NHS say they will go on strike again. So it isn't the end of looking for payments. But what I will go back to, because I set up my own business, my family's always had businesses, I deal with businesses all the time. And what you can hear today in the studio from this Labour government, they don't really know anything about businesses. The front bench don't really know anything about...
For 5 years,
the front bench have never really set up a business and don't really understand what's going on. So talking down the economy did crush confidence. Bringing in all these taxes meant they said, we cannot afford this. This was going to crush and shrink them. And that's what they've all said, haven't they? They've all said, we're laying off staff. They've all said, we're not growing, we're not expanding, because that budget in October was a disaster.
All right,
for
well,
businesses.
let me go to Helen. Let's put the budget to one side and go back to the election. Is the real problem, Helena, those promises, which the Conservatives did too, and it was called a conspiracy of silence by the Institute of Fiscal Studies and others, that to say that you wouldn't cut spending, that you wouldn't increase the main levers of taxation, and that you wouldn't borrow more, and then you did raise, and let's not argue about semantics, you did raise a big lever in terms of that increase in national insurance contributions, and therefore you broke a promise and you actually crushed people's expectations.
I don't accept that we broke a promise. We said very clearly in the election we would protect working people's
let's not
pay
argue
slips,
about the semantics.
which we did, and that's
But
important.
business weren't expecting it. But business weren't expecting it. Let's put it that way.
If you protect people's pay slips, they've got more money to spend locally in their local economies, in the restaurants like we just heard from. And this is really fundamental. Fixing our public services is vital to the fabric of our economy.
But you heard the businessman there in Burnley who said things were actually looking up until that October budget.
But just to give an example, you know, Esther says what she says about businesses. I worked for one of Britain's biggest businesses for 5 years before becoming an MP. And to give you one example, they had to invest in a GP on-demand service for their staff and pay for that out of their business budget. because their staff couldn't get GP appointments and were then missing work and being off sick. That's a really tangible example of how cutting NHS waiting lists is going to help British businesses. We've seen NHS waiting lists go down for 5 months in a row. What people voted for in the election was change that they can see in their public services,
right?
Whether that's the NHS
that's
or
why I come back. Let's not go back to it, because we've heard from the businesses there in Burnley, but that issue of fixing public services, that is what people wanted, and that could lead, I'm not saying it will, but it could lead to increased confidence in the economy.
Well, we haven't seen this yet, and what we do need to see, should it happen, but it's all could, would, maybe, and what we do need to understand, to pay for those changes to the public services means you need to have a healthy business economy which will pay for it. So that is never going to happen, because this Labour government, which is far removed from reality, is going to crush the people who are going to pay for all those services.
But to go back then to the spending cuts, you personally, I don't know about a Conservative government, you personally would see more departmental spending cuts to pay for the sorts of things that you would like to see. That's what you would advocate.
Well, what we've got to see, you don't just do cuts like a salami slicing, which Rachel Reeves doing. You've actually got to say, and this is where we're going and how we're going to change it, and how you'd have transformation in that.
What should government do less of?
Well, at the moment, I keep saying to you, we would do it differently. They've brought in a new quango a week since they've been in government. They have brought in GB Energy, things that we don't know what it's going to... There's lots of things.
But what should government actually fundamentally do less of? We know that Kemi Badenoch wants to see a smaller state. You would like to see a smaller state. What should we do less of?
Right, well, when you shrink something, you have to be growing something else. So I personally would be shrinking benefits, but not if you haven't got the jobs for it to go into. So what Labour's doing is such arbitrary changes, like 22-year-olds can't get benefits, which we're hearing from the citizens' advice. They don't understand what Labour are doing. They're just cutting away without the opportunities for people. And the Workers' Rights Bill is going to clear off even more businesses.
We might have time later on in the programme to talk about that. Just to say that we've got Prime Minister's questions coming up in just under 5 minutes or so. I'm sure they will keep to time, because obviously it's a packed day with the statement coming at 12:30, and we'll also hear a response from the Shadow Chancellor, Mel Stride, and the Liberal Democrats, Daisy Cooper. That question of what should government do less of seems to be a very difficult question for politicians to answer, that fundamentally the state should do less, but of what?
It's a massive question, isn't it? It's one we've seen the Prime Minister publicly wrestling with recently. And, you know, rooted in the kind of, in the numbers and what is affordable and the trade-offs, but then also stopping things is tricky, with then the temptation that, and you see this in all sorts of organisations as well as in government, of going down a kind of salami slicing route, because it is arguably an easier public argument to make than defend the abolition of something, which will always have those who would argue that it is a good thing, but others will make the case that that's exactly what you've got to do. Otherwise, the sort of scale and sort of networks and arm's length bodies of government continue to mushroom.
Well, we've got a series of questions here from viewers, and if I sort of broadly summarise, the thrust of it is, why doesn't the government just tax the ultra-wealthy or richer people instead of continually imposing austerity on our most vulnerable population? That's from Isabel, but it's the sort of theme running through many of the questions, particularly around how it's going to affect, as we heard from the woman Jim was talking to, how it's going to affect people on benefits.
Well, it's a choice, but, I mean, ultimately there's a balancing act in terms of the impact on the economy that you're trying to boost. Some of these people are the same people who might, you know, invest in the growth that creates jobs. So, you know, that is a constant balancing act. I think what we've seen in terms of some of the tax changes is, without sort of stating it as a strategy, you have seen little tweaks that try to get at some of the accrued wealth of an older generation that has come about through kind of housing going up. So it's kind of through second home ownership and the like. So that might be a strategy. But, I mean, I come back to what I said about, you know, if defence is going to go up 0.5 percentage point of GDP...
That's an awful lot.
And we've heard sort of rumours of a conversation with the public. I think the lesson I draw from what happened in autumn and summer with that, quote, painful budget. It was very odd. I mean, I've covered so many of these budgets, and you can say a budget's going to be tough, like George Osborne did on repeat. It shouldn't necessarily be painful, though. Everyone should benefit eventually. So that was odd, and you could see the impact, you really could, on consumer confidence. And then clearly, and I think the reality of the situation is this, is that the Conservatives cut national insurance for employees. And probably Labour didn't want to make that promise, and they were sort of boxed in to make the promise not to reverse it. If they'd had a free hand, they'd have simply reversed Jeremy Hunt's cut. In the end, they put it on employers, and that was highly concentrated on a very specific group, which is retail and hospitality, who are also squeezed by the national living wage rise. That is where the pain is concentrated. And so I question whether we might, if there was a rabbit, we're not expecting a white rabbit, a tiny bit more support in that area is where you might think they might want to go.
All right. Well, I can actually see Jeremy Hunt, a former Chancellor, standing up, rather coincidentally, maybe, just before she gives her statement, Rachel Reeves. But we are expecting Prime Minister's questions literally in the next moment. Chris, what's she got to do today?
She has to politically convince her own side in the country that she's got a plan and she's in charge ultimately. And she starts with an element on the back foot because the scale of today is grounded in the fact that things have happened in the last 6 months that she would have rather wish hadn't. And then I think very quickly afterwards, questions will then turn to what happens in the two next big events that spring on from this. One is the
I think it's time.
The second is the budget.
PMQs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today's spring statement will showcase a government going further and faster on the economy. Greenlighting the Lower Thames crossing, investing £2 million for 18,000 affordable homes for working families, 60,000 young people being trained, the next generation of construction workers, and fixing millions of potholes. We're undoing a decade of stagnation, delivering jobs and opportunities for working people and securing Britain's future. Mr. Speaker, tomorrow I'll meet President Macron in Paris to discuss further our efforts to secure a lasting peace in Ukraine. And may I welcome the delegation from Bring Back Kids initiative to the gallery. The abduction of Ukrainian children is grotesque. And the UK will play our full part to bring them home. It's a stark reminder that any peace settlement must see Russia held accountable for their deplorable actions. Mr. Speaker, this morning I have meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
John Slinger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Under this Labour government, NHS waiting lists are down 5 months in a row. Yeah. And the Hospital of St Cross in my constituency of Rugby is playing its part. But many of my constituents remain concerned about the long waits in A&E that they're experiencing that we inherited from the Conservatives, especially those who have to travel to the General Hospital in Coventry. So will the Prime Minister set out how our plan for change to bring the NHS back into the heart of government will help us to support the front line, deliver better emergency care closer to the community that our constituents have long called for?
Mr. Speaker, our plan for change already cut NHS waiting lists by almost 200,000. That's 5 months in a row during the winter months. The local trust waiting lists in his area are down 93%, and he's doing a great job for his community. We've already delivered 2 million extra appointments that we promised because of the record investment in the budget. The party opposite can't have it both ways. If they welcome NHS investment, they can't criticise raising the money to pay for it.
Leader of the Opposition, Kemi Beardall.
Mr. Speaker, in 30 minutes, we will hear the Chancellor's emergency budget. Yes. Even the Home Secretary's husband calls it an emergency budget. As she scrambles to fix the mess she made last October. But first, let's turn to another government minister who is making a mess of her brief, the Education Secretary. Why did Labour MPs vote against banning phones in schools last week?
Prime Minister.
Because it's completely unnecessary. I've got teenage children. Almost every school bans phones in school. They do it already. we need to concentrate on what's really important here, which is getting to the content that children shouldn't be accessing. That's where I would genuinely like to work across the House, because I think there's a huge amount of work to do. But the battle is not with schools that are already banning phones in school. The battle, and this is an important emerging battle, is to work together to ensure that we can ensure that the content that children are accessing, wherever they are, is suitable for their age.
Mr. Speaker, we can look at the content, but if the ban is unnecessary, then why is it that they've started a review? Just last week, his Education Secretary called a ban a bit gimmick, yet teachers and head teachers say the evidence already shows that schools that ban phones get better results. And he's wrong. Not all schools do this. Only 1 in 10 schools are smartphone free. So will he U-turn on this?
We need to ensure that all schools do this, but the vast majority do. It is really important that we focus on the battle we have to have with mobile phones, which is the content that children are able to access. And we need to ensure that that is controlled wherever they are. So it's a question of having the right battle on the right issue, not wasting time on something where almost all schools are already banning mobile phones.
Mr. Speaker, I'm surprised that the Prime Minister would say this. His own government evidence says that phones disrupt nearly half of GCSE classes every single day. Discipline is the #1 issue in many schools. Under the Conservatives, schools became twice as likely to be good or outstanding after going through our behaviour programme. So why did the Education Secretary abolish that programme?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, she talks about the record of the last government. Under their watch, 1/3 of children started school without appropriate level development, and that is not being able to use a knife and fork. 1/4 left primary school without the required standard of reading, writing and maths, and 1 in 5 was regularly absent. That's why we're pushing up standards, more information from Ofsted, transparency for parents, more interventions where schools need it.
Mr. Speaker, he's not answering the question about discipline in schools because he doesn't care about discipline in schools. Everything he does is ideological, and his decisions are costing schools so much. The national insurance hike means every state school in the country has to pay more for teachers. The Education Secretary promised to compensate schools in full for the jobs tax. Why hasn't it happened?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, it was Labour that introduced academies. We pushed up standards. And this is not ideological. I'm a parent of 2 teenage children, both of whom go to a state school. So I'm vested in this, and it matters hugely to me. Nothing ideological about it. That is why we're driving up standards, as we always have done.
Mr. Speaker, he didn't answer the question about compensating schools for the jobs tax. That is costing schools a lot of money. The CEO of the United Learning Group says the grant that they gave is 20% short. Some schools will face shortfalls of up to 35%. Can he guarantee that no teacher will lose their job as a result of his jobs tax?
Mr. Speaker, with this government at the budget that put a record amount into our schools, just as we put a record amount into our NHS and into our public services, we were utterly failed under the last government. But yet again, she wants all the benefits, the NHS, but she can't say how she's going to pay for it. That's what got us into the mess in the first place.
Mr. Speaker, the whole House will have heard that he could not guarantee that teachers' jobs are safe. Not only is he taxing schools, he's also lowering standards. He talks about our record. I'll tell him what our record was. Under the Conservatives, English schools shot up the international league tables, while schools in Labour-run Wales, standards fell. Academy freedoms led to the biggest improvement of standards in a generation. But the Education Secretary is attacking them with her reforms. Can the Prime Minister point to any evidence at all, that these discredited academy reforms will improve school standards?
Prime Minister. Yes, take the example of schools going into academies. The vast majority of schools are already academies. Therefore, we need to think again about what we do about failing schools that are already academies. We need to go on to the next chapter. And they never take the big decisions, and that's why we ended up their record. Open borders, which she was the cheerleader for, a crashed economy, mortgages through the roof, the NHS on its knees, hollowed out armed forces, and what have we got already under this government? 2 million extra NHS appointments, 750 breakfast clubs, including one in her constituency, record numbers of people being returned who shouldn't be here, and fully funded increase in defence spending. That's the difference a Labour government makes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I recently visited Harlow College and saw the work they were doing training the bricklayers and electricians of the future. Would the Prime Minister agree with me that work that FE colleges like Harlow College do is vital for the house building that we need for future generations? And what will his government do to support Harlow's next generation?
He's a great champion for his constituents. We are investing £600 million to train up to 60,000 more skilled house builders so we can support the next generation and deliver 1.5 million new homes. We're creating technical excellence colleges and investing in Stansted Airport, creating 5,000 jobs nearby, which will create more opportunities for young people in Harlow.
Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Red David.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The British drama Adolescence has shone a much-needed spotlight on the enormous damage being done by social media to the minds of many of our young people, especially teenage boys. We've argued social media giants should be much more toughly regulated and pay more tax so we can defend our young people from this harm. But we've had disturbing reports that the government is considering scrapping the digital services tax and watering down Britain's online safety legislation to appease President Trump and his co-president, Elon Musk. So will the Prime Minister today categorically rule out both of these things and make it clear that he will guarantee that British laws on tax and social media will be written in this House and not the White House?
Well, yes, of course, as he well knows. On the point he makes about online safety, it is important. There are new measures coming in the next few months, which are very important under the Act, and we need to see whether we can go further on this issue, because there are concerns as to whether they go far enough. But will the laws be made in this place? Of course they will.
Red David.
Well, I'm grateful for the Prime Minister's reply on the social media laws, but he didn't answer the point on the digital services tax, and we will come back to that. But moving on, Mr. Speaker, after President Trump's national security advisor accidentally added a journalist to a group chat that was discussing military action in Yemen, and given, I think, all the concerns that we share about President Trump's relationship with Vladimir Putin and J.D. Vance's insulting disdain for Britain and our armed forces, will the Prime Minister make it clear that he will order an urgent review into the security of the intelligence that we share with the United States?
Mr. Speaker, we work with the United States on a daily basis, and I think the honourable gentleman would like to think of himself as sort of reasonable, and when he's not jumping in Windermere, quite serious. But unpicking our relations with the US on defence and security is neither responsible nor serious.
So, judges.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Medina from Lyminge in my constituency is registered blind, and she recently told me how she had been failed by the broken social security system left behind by the Conservatives. She faced great difficulties in getting support from access to work, which is essential across my Ashford constituency, and was not helped to find paid employment. It is so important that disabled people who want to work are supported to do so. What is the Prime Minister's message to Medina and others like her who have been abandoned and shut out of employment for far too long?
Every person should have the right to work, and we will always protect the most severely disabled and those with lifelong health conditions. For Medina and the 200,000 others like her who can work and want to work, we need to support them. And that's why we're investing £1 billion in personalised tailoring employment programmes and introducing the right to try work guarantee. The party opposite presided over a failed system that didn't help them and then blamed them. We will never do that.
Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, those who know me well know that I don't talk of this often, but for half of my adult life, I was physically disabled. Indeed, when I first walked through the doors of this here chamber, I did so with a crutch in my right arm to support my body weight. I know how it feels. Right now in Scotland, some 55% of children living in poverty have a member of their household who is a disabled person. So can the Prime Minister explain to me, actually no, can the Prime Minister explain to those children how the Labour Party making mum and dad poorer will lift them out of poverty?
Well, I'm grateful to him for sharing his personal experience on this and his right to do so. My family has had living with disability for many years as well, so I do understand the human element of this. We do need to give support to those that need it. We do need to help those who want to work into work, and we need to be clear that those who can work should work. In England, we inherited a failed system that couldn't be defended. But it's also failing in Scotland. 84,000 young Scots, he focuses on young people, that's 15% of young Scots not in employment, education or training. That is terrible. Almost 300,000 Scots economically inactive due to temporary or long-term illness. Now, what we're doing is taking the steps to help people into work, £1 billion of employment support. They have record funding under the government, under the budget. What are they going to do to help the young Scots who have been failed by their government?
Andrew Ranger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Wrexham and Flintshire Investment Zone is one of the flagship examples of how, when this government talks about kick-starting economic growth, it means it. This £160 million plan will breathe new life into the local economy, create 6,000 good local jobs, meaning that for young people in Wrexham, they will be able to find more opportunities on their doorstep. Will the Prime Minister join with me in welcoming this important development for North Wales and the potential it unlocks?
Well, it is really important that we unleash the economic potential of North Wales, including kick-starting the investment zone, backed by major businesses, Mr. Speaker, like Airbus and JCB, to leverage £1 billion of private investment, investing £975 million to benefit aerospace workers at Broughton, where I met the fantastic young workers there, and securing £1 billion investment in Shotton Mill, securing 300 jobs on Deeside. And we put a record amount of money into the Welsh Government at the budget, a budget decision which was opposed by Plaid.
Sir Julian Lewis.
Question number 3, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
The Right Honourable Member asks about shale gas. There are very real economic and environmental consequences to fracking, and communities have clearly said no.
Sir Julian.
I'm sorry, but that answer had nothing to do with my question, which was to ask why the government are ordering the permanent sealing of Britain's only 2 shale gas wells. The government is perfectly entitled on environmental grounds to not exploit such wells in normal conditions. But does he not recognise that in a desperate situation such as an international conflict where other sources of power were cut off from us, taking a decision now to concrete these things over so that a future government could not use them is an extremely irresponsible and reckless
He knows there are real consequences of fracking, as I've set out. But what we need to do to secure our independence and lower bills and the next generation of jobs is move at speed to renewable energy. And that's why I'm pleased there's record investment coming into renewable energy so that tyrants like Putin can't put his boot on our throat. Now, if the party opposite don't want to support that investment, they should say so.
Kim Leadbeater.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the Prime Minister join me in thanking colleagues from across the House and the excellent clerks and staff who have spent the last few months working on the Assisted Dying Bill Committee. And would he agree with me that if the law is to change on assisted dying, it's extremely important that it is implemented as soon as it is safe and practicable to do so?
Can I congratulate all colleagues working on this bill and taking part in the debate? It is an important issue on which there are different views across the House and within parties. The bill is a matter for the House, but it is the government's role to ensure every piece of legislation that passes through Parliament is effective and workable. So we'll continue to work with my honourable friend as the bill sponsor to do that. In the same way, Mr Speaker, we would for every private member's bill which passes second reading, and if Parliament chooses to pass this bill, the government will implement it in a way that is safe and practicable.
Bradley Thomas.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Acorns Children's Hospice provides compassionate care to very young cancer patients and their families across Bromsgrove and the villages, yet it faces a staggering £416,000 increase in national insurance contributions as a result of choices made by this government. With no exemption for hospices and no uplift in non-capital funding, this means that the charity will have to draw from charitable donations made by the public, and this will affect frontline services. This is not right. Will the Prime Minister take this opportunity to right this wrong and exempt hospices from this tax?
We are investing £100 million for adult and children's hospices to improve facilities, equipment and accommodation, as well as £26 million in funding through the Children's Hospice Grant. But their cries and moaning would have a lot more value if they started their questions with an apology for crashing the economy in the first place.
Jacob Collier.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Roads in Burton, Uttoxeter and across Staffordshire are littered with potholes. Local people are forking out thousands because of the Conservatives' neglect and incompetence. And that's despite this Labour government giving Tory Staffordshire County Council £39 million to get the job done. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that the people of Staffordshire deserve better than roads with more dimples than a Staffordshire oat cake?
Prime Minister.
Look, he's right. Potholes are a real nuisance. And if you're using your car for work or your van and you hit a pothole, you're looking at a bill of several £100, which is unbudgeted for so many working families. That's why we're handing the West Midlands Combined Authority an additional £8.6 million to help repair their roads, part of a record £1.6 billion invested across the country. On top of that, Mr Speaker, every council must now publish how many potholes they've filled so we can show that we're making progress and that we're delivering something that didn't happen under last government.
John Cooper.
Mr Speaker, thank you. When he was Director of Public Prosecutions, the Right Honourable Gentleman would not, I think, have sat comfortably in the cabinet of Prime Minister Cameron. But incredibly, in Scotland, we have a situation where the head of prosecutions there, the Lord Advocate, does sit in cabinet. This has been thrown into sharp focus lately with a police probe into the finances of the SNP. It's further being thrown into sharp focus because ultimately, although not personally involved, the Lord Advocate does ultimately sit at the head of the investigation into the former First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon. She faced potential criminal charges. This situation has been created by the SNP. They will not fix it. Does it sit with this House to amend this situation?
Prime Minister.
Well, I'm grateful to this is a really important issue, and Labour in Scotland have been clear that they'd separate this role. That's the right thing to do for the reasons that have just been articulated. It's the obvious thing to do, and that's obviously what we do in England and Wales. Now, there have been calls for a review on this since 2021, but the SNP has not acted fast on those reviews. They really do need to bring forward proposals now to deal with the problems been sitting there for a very, very long time.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I join the Prime Minister in welcoming the delegation from Bring Back Kids, who are trying to return the tens of thousands of children abducted by Vladimir Putin, an act of pure evil. The Prime Minister will be aware that they've been working with the Yale University Humanitarian Lab, who were tracking thousands of those children inside Russia until recently. I say until recently because they've had their long-term funding removed. Will we consider using our existing contributions to the Partnership Fund for a Resilient Ukraine to restore that important work that they're doing, and in doing so restore the hope that those children can be returned to their anguished families?
Prime Minister. Well, I'm grateful to him for emphasising this again. Russia's abduction of Ukrainian children is sickening, and I think across the House we would all agree on that. A peace settlement in Ukraine must see Russia held to account and the children reunited with their families. And in specific reference to his question, the UK is playing our full part in international efforts, including funding the Bring Kids Back initiative through the Partnership Fund for a Resilient Ukraine. And I want to reassure the whole House we'll do everything we can to see these children returned and reintegrated as safely and as quickly as is possible.
Madeira Wilson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The 7-year-old adoptive daughter of my constituent Sarah suffered immense trauma in her early years. Thanks to support from the Adoption and Special Guardianship Support Fund, she's been able to access much-needed therapy that's helped her progress. But she and thousands of others don't know if they'll be able to get more help, because in just 5 days, that fund ends and ministers have repeatedly refused to confirm whether it will continue. So can the Prime Minister give a cast-iron guarantee to vulnerable children, adoptive parents and kinship carers that he won't cut this fund, and so that, in Sarah's words, she can give her daughter the absolute best second chance in life she deserves?
Well, we will set out details just as soon as we can on the basis of the principles that I set out earlier. The scheme overall, in terms of welfare, is not defendable on terms, but it must be a scheme that supports those that need it, and the details will be set out.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. While our nation was being engulfed last year by racist riots in Slough, Christians, Hindus, Jews, Sikhs, people of faith and no faith openly declared that if anybody tried to attack a mosque in our town, we'd stand in solidarity with our local Muslim community to protect it. However, since then, many have become more fearful with a rise in Islamophobic attacks, including this month at a mosque in Aberdeen. So can my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, confirm to the country what steps is the government taking to tackle such hate crime and promote community cohesion so that those seeking to divide our British society are not allowed to succeed?
Well, I thank him for his question. He does great work to bring our communities together, especially in Slough. Look, any form of racial or religious-based hatred is abhorrent and has no place in society. We have set aside over £50 million to protect faith communities and freedom of worship. That's the right thing to do. It's a shame that we have to do it. And our £15 million Community Recovery Fund has been supporting communities affected by the disorder last summer. Again, the right thing to do, but it's a shame that we have to do it.
Sir Roger Gale.
Speaker, Mr. Speaker, the problems faced by Heathrow earlier in the week have highlighted again the fact that since the closure of Manston Airport in Kent, South East lacks a major diversion facility. Now, one diversion facility would not, of course, have compensated for the closure of Heathrow, a major hub airport. But would the Prime Minister agree that with the reopening of Manston planned for October 2028, there will be a significant contribution to resilience of aviation in the South East?
Well, look, he's right to raise the concern about the situation in Heathrow. I think everybody is very concerned by what happened last week. There are clearly questions that need to be answered on a number of fronts in relation to what happened, and an investigation is ongoing. But I'm not going to announce particular parts of our policy and strategy here at this stage.
Irene Campbell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In my constituency of North Ayrshire and Arran, the SNP ferry fiasco is having a devastating social and economic impact on our Drawson and the Isle of Arran. As well as building a Calmac ferry that doesn't fit into the existing harbour, the Fraser of Allender Institute estimates that the disrupted ferries cost the Isle of Arran £170,000 of lost revenue per day. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that the SNP government needs to find a rapid solution to swiftly address this serious situation?
I thank her for fighting SNP incompetence on behalf of her constituents. Yet again, the SNP are failing island communities. hospital appointments are being missed and livelihoods destroyed. And Scotland has a proud history of shipbuilding and engineering. The SNP should be supporting Scottish workers and focusing on delivering for our communities.
Vicky Slade.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Camphor Magna in my constituency is proposed as a site for a new energy from waste incinerator, which will burn 260,000 tonnes of waste a year, more than the whole of Dorset's use. And I'm concerned that as we reduce our levels of waste with the brilliant new plans to recycle more, we're going to end up having to feed the monster. The area already has 95% of the capacity, so does the Prime Minister agree with me that we shouldn't allow new plants where we already have sufficient capacity, or where carbon capture is not going to be included?
Yeah. I hope she'll forgive me. The details of the particular incinerator she speaks of, I don't know the details. I'm not across that. But I will make sure that she gets an answer to her question in written form as soon as possible.
Chris MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I commend my right honourable friend for his leadership on Ukraine, showing that the UK is once again at the forefront of protecting democratic freedoms. Does he agree with me that as our defence spending increases, we need to support our supply chain companies to increase their capability, creating good jobs and apprenticeships in places like Stockton North and across the country? And will he meet with me and our Teesside Defence and Innovation Cluster that I've established, which is helping to create that new defence capability for the UK?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, this is a once-in-a-generation moment for security of our country and our continent. We've set out that fully funded increase in defence spending to 2.5% in 2027, the biggest sustained boost since the Cold War. But that must benefit British jobs and British businesses. And that's why I'll make sure that he gets the meeting that he wants with the relevant minister.
Jerome Mayo.
In October last year, the Chancellor delivered a massive tax, borrow and spend budget. Now her plans have collapsed around her ears with an emergency budget to cut that spending. So has the time now come, Mr Speaker, for the Prime Minister to state in public that he has full confidence in the Chancellor?
I have full confidence in the Chancellor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Albion Rovers has been a football institution in Coatbridge since 1882. However, following relegation and the lack of financial support for teams leaving professional leagues, it now faces a deeply perilous situation, risking the very future of one of Scotland's oldest football clubs. Does my right honourable friend agree that clubs like Albion Rovers are integral to the fabric of our communities? And will he join me in encouraging all parties to be solution-focused on this matter and encourage football authorities to strengthen our clubs in the lower leagues to help protect their future?
Well, he's a superb local champion, and regardless of which club any of us support, they share a love of the game, and they are at the heart of our communities, and Albion Rovers is exactly that, a huge point of local pride, and I'd encourage all efforts to secure the future of the club.
Final question, Dr Kieran Mullen.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. We're joined in Parliament today by Katie Brett, whose 16-year-old sister Sasha was raped and stabbed to death. Aisha Hussain, whose cousin Jan, was killed by a sex offender and stored her body in a freezer. Paula Hudgell, whose adopted son Tony lost his lower legs as a result of child cruelty, and Becky and Glenn Newens, whose daughter Violet Grace was killed by a hit-and-run driver who spent barely more time in prison than she was alive. Supporting them are Jeremy and Susan Everard, who received justice for the murder of their daughter, Sarah, but who know too many others do not. They've come together to say with one voice that it's time for us to start ensuring sentences truly deliver justice for victims and their families. Would the Prime Minister agree to meeting with them in future to hear their stories firsthand?
Well, can I thank him for raising this issue? The courage of these campaigners after simply appalling cases is astounding, and I find it humbling. I'm pleased the Minister for Victims will be meeting the group, I think, today, and I look forward to meeting them in the future, because we must prioritise victims and make sure sentences punish offenders and protect the public. So thank him for raising this really important set of cases.
That completes Prime Minister's questions. We'll let front bench change up.
And you can hear the Speaker there announcing the end of Prime Minister's questions and a brief transition in order for the Chancellor Rachel Reeves to take her place ahead of delivering her statement. We're expecting her to speak and be on her feet for between 20 minutes and half an hour. And then the response will come from the Conservatives on the opposite side, from Mel Stride, the Shadow Chancellor, and also the Liberal Democrats.
Come to the spring statement. Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves.
Mr. Speaker, this Labour government was elected to bring change to our country, to provide security for working people and to deliver a decade of national renewal. That work began in July, and I am proud of what we have delivered in just 9 months. Restoring stability to our public finances, giving the Bank of England the foundation to cut interest rates 3 times since the general election, rebuilding our public services with record investment in our NHS, bringing waiting lists down for 5 months in a row, and increasing the national living wage to give 3 million people a pay rise from next week. Now our task is to secure Britain's future in a world that is changing before our eyes. The threat facing our continent was transformed when Putin invaded Ukraine. It has since escalated further and will continue to evolve rapidly. At the same time, the global economy has become more uncertain, bringing insecurity at home as trading patterns become more unstable and borrowing costs rise for many major economies. Mr. Speaker, the job of a responsible government is not simply to watch this change. This moment demands an active government, a government not stepping back, but stepping up. A government on the side of working people, helping Britain to reach its potential. And Mr. Speaker, we have the strength to do just that. As one of the world's largest economies, an ally to trading partners across the globe, and a hub for global innovation. These strengths and the progress that we have made so far mean that we can act quickly and decisively in a more uncertain world to secure Britain's future and to deliver prosperity for working people. Mr. Speaker, as I set out at the budget last year, I am today returning to the House to provide an update on our public finances, supported by a new forecast from the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility. Ahead of a full spending review in June, I will then return to the House in the autumn to deliver a budget in line with our commitment to deliver just one major fiscal event a year. So let me now turn to the OBR's forecasts. And I want to thank Richard Hughes and his team for their dedicated work. The increased global uncertainty has had 2 consequences. First, on our public finances, and second, on our economy. I will take each in turn. In the autumn, I set out our new fiscal rules that would guide this government. These fiscal rules are non-negotiable. They are the embodiment of this government's unwavering commitment to bring stability to our economy and to ensure security for working people. Because the British people have seen what happens when a government borrows beyond their means. The mini-budget delivered by the party opposite resulted in higher bills, in higher rents and higher mortgages. And, Mr. Speaker, it was not the wealthy who suffered most when they crushed the economy. It was ordinary working people. And they continue to feel the effects 2.5 years later of the damage that the party opposite did. Now let me be clear. There is nothing progressive, there is nothing Labour about working people paying the price for economic irresponsibility. The British people put their trust in this Labour government because they knew that I would never take risks with the public finances, that we would never do anything to put household finances in danger. And we must earn that trust every single day. The 2 rules that I set out at the budget were first, our stability rule, which ensures that public spending is under control, balancing the current budget by 2029-30, so that day-to-day spending is met by tax receipts. Second, our investment rule, to drive growth in the economy, ensuring that net financial debt falls by the end of the forecast period, while enabling us to invest alongside business. Turning first to the stability rule. The OBR's forecast shows that before the steps that I will take in this statement, the current budget would have been in deficit by £4.1 billion in 2029-30, having been in surplus by £9.9 billion in the autumn, as the UK, alongside our international peers like France and Germany, has seen the cost of borrowing rise during this period of heightened uncertainty in global markets. As a result of the steps that I am taking today, I can confirm that I have restored in full our headroom against the stability rule, moving from a deficit of £36.1 billion in 2025-26 and £13.4 billion in 2026-27 to a surplus of £6.0 billion in 27-28, £7.1 billion in 2028-29 and a surplus of £9.9 billion in 2029-30. That compares to the headroom left by the previous government of just £6.5 billion. That means we are continuing to meet the stability rule 2 years early, building resilience to shocks in this, a more uncertain world. The OBR forecast that the investment rule is also met 2 years early, with net financial debt of 82.9% of GDP in 25-26 and 83.5% in 26-27, before falling to 83.4% in 27-28, in 83.2% in 2028-29, and then to 82.7% in 2029-30, providing headroom of £15.1 billion in the final year of the forecast, broadly unchanged from the autumn. After the last government doubled the national debt, after they doubled the national debt interest payments now stand at £105.2 billion this year. Mr. Speaker, that is more than we allocate to defence, the Home Office and the Ministry of Justice combined. That is the legacy of the party opposite. So the responsible choice is to reduce our levels of debt and borrowing in the years ahead, so that we can spend more on the priorities of working people, and that is exactly what this government will do. Mr. Speaker, I said that our fiscal rules were non-negotiable, and I meant it. I will always deliver economic stability, and I will always put working people first. I said it at the election, I said it at the budget, and I say it again today. Let me now set out the steps that the government has taken. At the budget, we protected working people by keeping our promise not to raise their rates of national insurance, income tax or VAT. At the same time, we began to rebuild our public services after the party opposite left a £22 billion black hole in our public finances. Ours were the right choices for stability and the right choices for renewal, funded by the decisions that we took on tax. As I promised in the autumn, this statement does not contain any further tax increases. But when working people are paying their taxes while still struggling with the cost of living, it cannot be right that others are still evading what they rightly owe in tax. In the budget, I delivered the most ambitious package of measures that we have ever seen to cut down on tax evasion, raising £6.5 billion per year by the end of the forecast. Today, I go further, continuing our investment in cutting-edge technology, investing in the HMRC's capacity to crack down on tax avoidance, and setting out plans to increase the number of tax fraudsters charged every year by 20%. These changes raise a further £1 billion, taking the total revenue raised from reducing tax evasion under this Labour government to £7.5 billion. These figures are verified by the Office for Budget Responsibility, and I want to thank my honourable friend, the Exchequer Secretary, for his continued work in this area. Mr. Speaker, last week, my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, set out this government's plans to reform the welfare system. The Labour Party is the party of work. We believe that if you can work, you should work. But if you can't work, you should be properly supported. This government inherited a broken system. More than 1,000 people every day are qualifying for personal independence payments. 1 in 8 young people are not in employment, education or training. If we do nothing, we are writing off an entire generation. That cannot be right, and we will not stand for it. It is a waste of their potential, and it is a waste of their futures, and we will change it. As my right honourable friend said in her statement last week, the final costings would be subject to the OBR's assessment. Today, the OBR have said that they estimate that the package will save £4.8 billion in the welfare budget, reflecting their judgments on behavioural effects and wider factors. This also reflects final adjustments to the overall package, consistent with the Secretary of State's statement last week and the Government's Pathways to Work Green Paper. The Universal Credit Standard Allowance will increase from £92 per week in 25-26 to £106 a week by 29-30, while the Universal Credit Health element will be cut for new claimants by around 50% and then frozen. On top of this, we are investing £1 billion to provide guaranteed, personalised employment support to help people back into work. And £400 million to support the Department for Work and Pensions and our job centres to deliver these changes effectively and fairly, taking total savings after that to the package to £3.4 billion. While spending on disability and sickness benefits will continue to rise, these plans mean that welfare spending as a share of GDP will fall between 2026 and the end of the forecast period, very different to what we inherited from the party opposite. We are reforming our welfare system, making it more sustainable, protecting the most vulnerable, and most importantly, supporting more people back into secure work, lifting them out of poverty. Mr. Speaker, at the budget, I fixed the foundations of our economy to deliver on the promise of change. That work has already begun. 2 million extra appointments in our NHS. Waiting lists down. New breakfast clubs opening across England. The largest settlements in real terms for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland in the history of devolution. Asylum costs falling, promises made, promises kept, and every single one of them opposed by the parties opposite. At the budget, alongside providing an increase in funding for this year and next, I set the envelope for the spending review, which we will deliver in June, led by my right honourable friend, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, to set departmental budgets until 28-29 for day-to-day spending and until 2029-30 for capital spending. Today, I'm reflecting 2 steps that we have taken on our spending plans. First, because we are living in an uncertain world, as the Prime Minister has set out, we will increase defence spending to 2.5% of GDP, reducing overseas aid to 0.3% of gross national income. This means we save £2.6 billion in day-to-day spending in 2029-30 to fund our more capital-intensive defence commitments. Second, in recent months, we have begun to fundamentally reform the British state, driving efficiency and productivity across government to deliver tangible savings and improve services across our country. Earlier this the Prime Minister set out plans to abolish the arm's-length body NHS England and ensure that that money goes directly to improving the service for patients. My right honourable friend, the Health Secretary, is driving forward vital reforms to increase NHS productivity, bearing down on costly agency spend to save money so that we can improve patient care. And my right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, is taking forward work to significantly reduce the costs of running government by 15%, worth £2 billion by the end of the decade. This work shows that we can make our state leaner and more agile, delivering more resources to the front line, while ensuring that we control day-to-day spending to meet our fiscal rules. Today, I build on that work by bringing forward £3.25 billion of investment to deliver the reforms that our public services need through a new transformation fund. That is money brought forward now to bring down the costs of running government by the end of the forecast period, by making public services more efficient, more productive and more focused on the user. I can confirm today the first allocations from this fund, including funding for voluntary exit schemes to reduce the size of the civil service, pioneering AI tools to modernise the state, investment in technology for the Ministry of Justice to deliver probation services more effectively, and upfront investment so we can support more children into foster care to give them the best possible start in life and reduce cost pressures in the future. Our work to make government leaner, more productive and more efficient will help deliver a further £3.5 billion of day-to-day savings by 2029-30. Overall, day-to-day spending will be reduced by £6.1 billion in 2029-30, and it will now grow by an average of 1.2% a year above inflation, compared to 1.3% in the autumn. Mr. Speaker, I can confirm to the House that day-to-day spending will increase in real terms above inflation in every single year of the forecast. And in the spending review, apart from the reductions in overseas aid, day-to-day spending across government has been fully protected. I can also confirm our approach to capital investment. In the autumn budget, I announced £100 billion of additional capital spending to crowd in investment from the private sector, to fix our crumbling infrastructure, and to create jobs in every corner of our country. Today, I am not cutting capital spending, as the party opposite did, time and time again, because that choked off growth, and it left our school roofs literally crumbling. That was the wrong choice. It was the irresponsible choice. It was the Tory choice. Today, I am instead increasing capital spending by an average of £2 billion per year compared with the autumn, to drive growth in our economy and to deliver in full our vital commitments on defence. This government will ensure that every pound we spend will deliver for the British people by increasing productivity, driving growth in our economy and improving our frontline public services. Mr. Speaker, let me turn now to the impact of increased uncertainty on our economy. To deliver economic stability, we must work closely with the Bank of England, supporting the Independent Monetary Policy Committee to meet their 2% inflation target. There have been 3 interest rate cuts since the general election, and today's data showed that inflation fell in February. Having peaked at 11% under the previous government, the OBR forecast that CPI inflation will average 3.2% this year before falling rapidly to 2.1% in 2026 and meeting the 2% target from 2027 onwards, giving families and businesses the security that they need and providing our economy with the stable platform it needs to grow. Mr. Speaker, earlier this month, the OECD downgraded this year's growth forecast for every G7 economy, including the UK. And the OBR have today revised down our growth forecast for 2025, from 2% in the autumn to 1% today. I am not satisfied with these numbers, and that is why we, on this side of the House, are serious about taking the action needed to grow our economy. Backing the builders, not the blockers, with a third runway at Heathrow Airport and the Planning and Infrastructure Bill. increasing investment with reforms to our pension system and a new national wealth fund, and tearing down regulatory barriers in every sector of our economy. That is a serious plan for growth. That is a serious plan to improve living standards. That is a serious plan to renew our country. Mr. Speaker, a changing world presents challenges, but it also presents new opportunities for new jobs and new contracts in our world-class defence industrial centres, from Belfast to Deeside and from Plymouth to Rosyth. In February, the Prime Minister set out our government's commitment to increase spending on defence to 2.5% of GDP from April 2027, the biggest sustained increase in defence spending since the end of the Cold War, with an ambition to spend 3% of GDP on defence in the next Parliament. That was the right decision in a more insecure world, putting an extra £6.4 billion into defence spending by 2027. But we have to move quickly in this changing world, and that starts with investment. So today I can confirm that I will provide an additional £2.2 billion for the Ministry of Defence in the next financial year, a further down payment on our plans to deliver 2.5% of GDP by 2027. This additional investment is not just about increasing our national security, but increasing our economic security too. As defence spending rises, I want the whole country to feel its benefits. So I will now set out the immediate steps that we are taking to boost Britain's defence industry and to make the UK a defence industrial superpower. We will spend a minimum of 10% of the Ministry of Defence's equipment budget on new novel technologies, including drones and AI-enabled technology, driving forward advanced manufacturing production in places like Glasgow, in Derby and in Newport, creating demand for highly skilled engineers and scientists, and delivering new business opportunities for UK tech firms and start-ups. We will establish a protected budget of £400 million within the Ministry of Defence, a budget that will rise over time for UK defence innovation, with a clear mandate to bring innovative technology to the front line at speed. And we will reform our broken defence procurement system, making it quicker, more agile and more streamlined, and giving small businesses across the UK better access to Ministry of Defence contracts, something welcomed by the Federation of Small Businesses. We will take forward our plan for Barrow, a town at the heart of our nuclear security, working with my honourable friend, the member for Barrow and Furness, and providing £200 million, supporting the creation of thousands of jobs there. We will regenerate Portsmouth Naval Base, securing its future, as called for by my honourable friend, the member for Portsmouth South. We will secure better homes for thousands of military families, the homes that they deserve, denied to them by the previous government. Homes for our military families in constituencies of my honourable friends for Plymouth Moorview, Plymouth Sutton and Devonport, York Outer and in Aldershot. That is the difference that this Labour government is making. Finally, Mr. Speaker, we will provide £2 billion of increased capacity for UK export finance to provide loans for overseas buyers of UK defence goods and services, because I want to do more with our defence budget so we can buy and make and sell things here in Britain. Giving further opportunities for our world-leading defence companies and those who work in them to grow and create jobs here in Britain as military spending rightly increases all across Europe. To oversee all of this vital work, my right honourable friend, the Defence Secretary and I will establish a new Defence Growth Board to maximise the benefits from every pound of taxpayers' money that we spend. And we will put defence at the heart of our modern industrial strategy to drive innovation that can deliver huge benefits back into the British economy. Mr. Speaker, that is how we make our country a defence industrial superpower. So the skills of the future, the jobs of the future and the opportunities of the future can be found right here in the United Kingdom. Mr. Speaker, as the previous government learned to their detriment, there are no shortcuts to economic growth. It will take long-term decisions. It will take hard yards. It will take time for the reforms that we are introducing to be felt in the everyday economy. It is right that the Office for Budget Responsibility consider the evidence and look carefully at measures before recognising a growth impact in their forecast. But, Mr. Speaker, I can announce to the House that the OBR have considered and have scored one of the central planks of our plan for growth. In my first week as Chancellor, I announced that we were pursuing the most ambitious set of planning reforms in decades to get Britain building again. And in December, we published changes to the National Planning Policy Framework, driven forward tirelessly by my right honourable friend, the Deputy Prime Minister. Reintroducing mandatory housing targets and bringing grey belt land into scope. The OBR have today concluded that these reforms will permanently increase the level of real GDP by 0.2% in 29-30, an additional £6.8 billion for our economy, and by 0.4% of GDP within 10 years, an additional £15.1 billion in our British economy. Mr. Speaker, that is the biggest positive growth impact that the OBR have ever reflected in their forecast for a policy with no fiscal cost. And taken together with our plans to increase capital spending that we set out in the budget last year, this government's policies will increase the level of real GDP by 0.6% in the next 10 years. Mr. Speaker, that is the difference that this Labour government is making. Policies to grow our economy. Promises by a Labour government, delivered by a Labour government, opposed by the parties opposite. Mr. Speaker, the planning system that we inherited was far too slow. The OBR have concluded that our reforms will lead to house building reaching a 40-year high. 305,000 homes a year by the end of the forecast period. And changes to the National Planning Policy Framework alone will help build over 1.3 million homes in the UK over the next 5 years, taking us within touching distance of delivering our manifesto promise to build 1.5 million homes in England in this Parliament. Homes promised by this Labour government, homes built by this Labour government, homes opposed by the parties opposite. The impact on our economy goes further still. I said at the election that we could not simply tax and spend our way to prosperity. We need economic growth. So I can today confirm that the effect of our growth policies, including our planning reforms, means an additional £3.4 billion to support our public finances and our public services by 2029-30. The proceeds of growth, promised by this Labour government, delivered by this Labour government, opposed by the parties opposite. Mr. Speaker, earlier this week, we provided an additional £2 billion of investment in social and affordable homes next year, delivering up to 18,000 new homes and allowing local areas to bid for new development across our country, including sites in Thanet, in Sunderland and in Swindon. More security for families across our country, promised by this Labour government, delivered by this Labour government and opposed by the parties opposite. And to build these new homes, we need people with the right skills. Earlier this week, my right honourable friend, the Education Secretary, announced more than £600 million to train up 60,000 more construction workers, including with 10 new technical excellence colleges across every region of our country, giving working people the chance to fulfil their potential. New opportunities for our young people, promised by this Labour government, delivered by this Labour government, opposed by the parties opposite. Mr. Speaker, all this is just the start. The Planning and Infrastructure Bill passed its second reading on Monday. No thanks to the parties opposite. Once this bill completes its passage, It will help deliver the homes and infrastructure our country badly needs. And I say to the parties opposite, the British people will be watching. Because if the parties opposite don't support these reforms, let us be clear about what that means. They are opposing economic growth. They are opposing more homes for families. They are opposing good jobs across our country. We on this side are clear about whose side we are on. The parties opposite must decide too. This Labour government is taking the right decisions now to secure Britain's future. And today I can confirm to the House that the OBR have upgraded their growth forecast next year and every single year thereafter. With GDP growth of 1.9% in 2026, of 1.8% in 2027, 1.7% in 2028 and 1.8% in 2029. Mr. Speaker, by the end of the forecast, our economy is larger compared to the OBR's forecast at the time of the budget. That is the difference that this Labour government is making. But, Mr. Speaker, this isn't just about lines on a graph. It's about improving people's lives. Working people are still feeling the pinch after a cost of living crisis caused by the party opposite that caused interest rates and inflation to go through the roof. So I am pleased that the OBR confirmed today that real household disposable income will now grow this year at almost twice the rate expected in the autumn. Compared to the forecast in the final budget delivered by the party opposite, and after taking into account inflation, the OBR say today that people will be, on average, over £500 a year better off under this Labour government. That will mean more money in the pockets of working people, higher living standards promised by this Labour government, delivered by this Labour government, opposed by the parties opposite. Mr. Speaker, the world is changing. We can see that and we can feel it. A changing world demands a government that is on the side of working people, acting in their interest, acting in the national interest, not retreating from challenges, not stepping back, but a government with the courage to step up, to secure Britain's future, and to seize the opportunities that are out there before us. I am impatient for change. The British people are impatient for change after 14 years of failure. And we are beginning to see change happen. Our plan for change is working. Defence spending is rising. Waiting lists are falling. Wages are up. Interest rates are cut. That is the difference that this Labour government is making. And today, Mr. Speaker, the OBR confirm that our plan to get Britain building will drive growth in our economy and put more money in people's pockets. There are no quick fixes, but we have taken the right choices, returning stability to our economy after years of mismanagement by the party opposite, delivering security for our country and security for working people. That is what drives this government. That is what drives me as Chancellor. That is what drives the choices that I have set out today, and I commend this statement to the House.
Rachel Reeves sits down after delivering a pretty punchy statement there, being congratulated by the Prime Minister. She was on her feet for just over half an hour. Let's hear the Shadow Chancellor, Mel Stride.
Budget, the Right Honourable Lady said that she would bring stability to the public finances. Stability to the public finances. But this statement, more appropriately referred to as an emergency budget, has brought her to a cold hard...
Can I just say to you, quite rightly I want to hear to the Chancellor. I now want to hear the Shadow Chancellor. I don't need any help.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This emergency budget, Mr. Speaker, has brought the Right Honourable Lady to a cold, hard reckoning. She has become very fond recently to talk about the world having changed. Well, indeed it has, Mr. Speaker. This country was growing at the fastest rate in the G7 only about a year ago. And just as the OECD and the Bank of England and other forecasters, and now we learn today the OBR have stated, growth has been halved in this year, cut in two as a consequence of the decisions and the choices that the Right Honourable Lady made on her watch. Inflation, which was down to 2%, bang on target on the very day of the last general election under a Conservative government. We are now told this year will be running at twice the level as was forecast under ourselves in 2024. This is going to mean prices bearing down on households and on businesses right across the country because of her choices. And the OBR also says, Mr. Speaker, that unemployment will be rising this year and next year and the year after. And in fact, across the forecast period, it will not decline at all. So much for the Right Honourable Lady's back-to-work plans. And we have already seen, Mr. Speaker, what it means when it comes to controlling borrowing under this Chancellor. And yes, she has come forward now with a plan to squeeze spending later on in the forecast period. And she has, of course, told the OBR that these are the elements of spending restraint to which she will stick. But what do the markets think? And could I ask the Right Honourable Lady, given her track record, given the fact that she has failed to control spending and borrowing to date, what does she think the markets are going to make of her latest promises? But the Right Honourable Lady, Mr. Speaker, says, of course, that none of this is her fault. It is the war in Ukraine. It is President Trump. It is tariffs. It is President Putin. It is the Conservatives. It is her legacy. It is anybody but her. Well, what the British people know, Mr. Speaker, is that this is a consequence of her choices. She is the architect of her own misfortune. It was the Right Honourable Lady, Mr. Speaker, who talked down the economy, so that business surveys and confidence crashed through the floor. It was the Right Honourable Lady who confected the £22 billion black hole. A smokescreen that was only ever there in order to cover up for the fact that she and the Prime Minister reneged on their promises to the British people during the last general election. And a black hole that the OBR themselves, ironically at the government's behest, have said they will not legitimise. She chose to be reckless with a sliver of headroom against her fiddled targets. She borrowed and spent and taxed like it was the 1970s. Little wonder, Mr. Speaker, that the Chancellor has tanked the economy. Little wonder we have an emergency budget, all because of her choices. Now, the Chancellor likes to tour the television studios and tell everybody they should be thankful that she will not be ramping up taxes in this emergency budget as she did before. But that will be cold comfort to the millions up and down the country waiting in fear and trepidation for the start of the new tax year, buckling under the burden of tax that will be rising to the highest tax burden on her watch in the history of our country. And so could I ask the Right Honourable Lady if, when she replies in a moment, she will give that much-needed reassurance, particularly to businesses, that she will not be ramping up taxes still further in the autumn. Even a basic economist, Mr. Speaker, knows that if you tax something, you get less of it. You don't need to have worked at the Bank of England for 10 years, Mr. Speaker, to know that. So what did the Chancellor tax? She taxed jobs and wealth creation. She's destroyed livelihoods, businesses clobbered, big and small companies, the backbone of our economy. Enterprise crushed on the altar of her ineptitude. The CIPD telling us a third of those businesses affected will shed labour. Morrison's losing 200 jobs, Tesco 400, Sainsbury's 3,000 jobs lost. No wonder the Federation of Small Business say that outside of the pandemic, business confidence has been left at its lowest level on record. But it's not just businesses, Mr. Speaker. It's charities, it's GPs, it's pharmacists, it's those who transport children who have special educational needs, and it is hospices caring for the sick and the dying. In this House, Mr. Speaker, the Labour Party had the opportunity yesterday and last week to stop that, but they voted our amendments down. And we will never let their constituents forget it. Mr. Speaker, if you ramp up taxes, if you ramp up borrowing and spending without any commensurate improvement in productivity, it leads to growing inflation. And inflation has been increasing on this government's watch. It means that interest rates stay higher for longer. The Chancellor just now trumpeted the fact that there had been 3 interest rate cuts since the Labour Party came to office. She knows full well there should have been more than that had she managed. She knows full well. She knows full well. She knows full well, Mr. Speaker. She knows full well that interest rates are higher for longer because of the choices that she took. And this has led, Mr. Speaker, to servicing costs for our national debt, which is running at twice the defence budget. And today we have learned from the OBR that debt interest is to increase still further. None of this money, Mr. Speaker, is going to be spent on public services. It will be going down the drain. Mr. Speaker, the real black hole, Mr. Speaker, the real black hole is not the one the Chancellor invented, it is the one the Chancellor created. It's not a central problem, Mr. Speaker, the fact that this Chancellor is a gambler. Even with her fiddled fiscal targets, she left way too little headroom. Way too little headroom. And it's not the truth that whilst the Right Honourable Lady said at the last budget that that was a once-in-a-Parliament reset, she rolled the dice on a wafer-thin margin, and she lost. Reckless with her fingers crossed, she fiddled the targets and she missed them.
I'm not sure about the language we use. I think there are better words and more constructive words the Shadow Chancellor would prefer to use.
Can I just point out, thank you, Mr. Can I just point out that all of her fiscal headroom disappeared, not just some of it. In fact, she went underwater to the tune of £4.1 billion. Mr. Speaker, reeling from one fiscal event to the next is not a way to run the public finances. And breaking your fiscal rules to the extent that the Right Honourable Lady has in just 6 months is a public humiliation. Mr. Speaker, could I briefly focus on defence spending? We on this side of the House welcome the fact that, as we press the government to do, they will reach 2.5% of GDP by 2027. And we note the stepping stone along the way that the Right Honourable Lady has just announced. But we should go further than that. The 3% target should be brought forward to this Parliament. So can I ask the Right Honourable Lady, given the geopolitical tensions that she has raised, what provision has she made in her headroom, in her fiscal plans, for increasing defence spending more quickly in this Parliament if that proves necessary? And could I ask her, would she scrap the absurd Chagos deal and put that and put that money behind our armed forces. Mr. Speaker, the economy is in a perilous state, but there was a different way. There were different choices on taxing and spending and borrowing and on productivity and on welfare. And let me just say a few words on welfare. It was the privilege of my life, Mr. Speaker, to have served as the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions. And when it came to welfare reform, with that privilege came a deep responsibility. The responsibility for welfare reform to be properly thought through with a very clear plan. So I know they don't like it because it's an alien idea, Mr. Speaker, to the party opposite. So that we can be fair to the taxpayer, but equally fair to the many people up and down our country, some of whom are highly vulnerable. This was an approach on our watch that led to $5 billion of savings across the forecast period and 450,000 fewer people going on to long-term sickness and disability benefits as a direct consequence. And we would have gone further, much further, and we set out a clear plan, we set out a clear plan in our manifesto to do exactly that. But the party opposite rushed their changes. They had no plan. There was not a single mention of PIP, personal independence payments, in the Labour Party manifesto. When they got into office, they pussyfooted around and dithered. Why? Because it's deeply divisive within their rank and file. And then suddenly, when the Chancellor decided that she had run out of money, out the word went to find some savings in welfare, to scrabble around, to yank every lever possible. And the spectacle, frankly, Mr. Speaker, of what the OBR has said about the changes that were only announced last week by the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions is simply shambolic. Yes. We have gone from incompetence, Mr. Speaker, to chaos. There have been more changes in this policy than there were at the last minute to the profile of the Right Honourable Lady on LinkedIn. The result is the worst of all worlds, a wholly inadequate level of savings on welfare, with welfare costs still spiralling ever higher, and changes that were likely to harm many vulnerable people. So could I ask the Right Honourable Lady, when the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions came to the House last week with these changes, she did not provide an impact assessment. Was this because the OBR had not signed off the numbers? Was it because the department did not have enough time to produce one? Or was it only provided today, as many of us suspect, because this was thought to be a good time to bury bad news? Mr. Speaker, the forecast for growth is down, for borrowing costs is up, for inflation is up, and business confidence has been smashed in a million pieces. This Chancellor constantly trying to blame forces beyond her control. The right response is not to duck responsibility, but to build a resilient economy. The Right Honourable Lady would have us believe that that is what she is doing. But how can we believe this Chancellor? How can we trust this Chancellor? She is the Chancellor who said she would not increase borrowing, but she did. She said she wouldn't change her fiscal rules, but she did. She said she wouldn't put up national insurance, but she did. She said she wouldn't cut winter fuel payment, but she did. She said she wouldn't tax farmers, but she did. And she said she would not move to more than one fiscal event a year, and she just has. And now we are all paying the price of her broken promises. Today's numbers confirm it. We are poorer and we are weaker. To govern, Mr. Speaker, is to choose. And this Chancellor has made all the wrong choices.
Chancellor of the Exchequer.
OK, well, I know that the Chancellor hasn't been in...
And that ends the response there from the Shadow Chancellor for the Conservatives, Mel Stride, questioning the Chancellor Rachel Reeves, who is back on her feet. But let's go through some of the main points that were announced by Rachel Reeves. And remember, this was all about the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility scoring, to use her word, some of the policies that she says are going to be put in place, and which meant the main bit of good news for her was that after downgrading growth for this year, they have upgraded it for the following 3 years. We'll go through the figures in just a moment, but let me take you through some of the other main measures, because Rachel Reeves has said that what we called her fiscal headroom of £9.9 billion is going to be restored in 2029-2030, after it was predicted to be wiped out, and she would have missed it by just over £4 billion. She said no further tax increases. Well, we weren't expecting any tax increases in the statement, but we just heard there from Mel Stride, the Shadow Chancellor, asking whether they could be some in the autumn. Economic growth, as I said, halved to 1% in 2025. The OBR had said it would be 2%, but then it is upgraded, if we look here at the measures, in the next few years, from 2026 onwards. Growth that has very much been lacking since they came to power. Public spending, she said, will go down, day-to-day public spending, by £6.1 billion in 2029-30. We've heard some of the plans to bring that down by efficiencies, by cutting numbers in the civil service. If we go over and have a look at some of the other measures, further cuts to universal credit. We talked about this before. The statement that, in fact, she'd been told that the plans and changes that have been set out recently by Liz Kendall weren't going to bring in the £5 billion. She's now taking more cuts, or making more cuts, and the OBR thinks it will bring in 4.8, or save, I should say, £4.8 billion. So those savings coming from welfare, rather than some on the left of the party who say it should come from tax increases or more borrowing. An extra £2.2 billion of defence spending next year. That is all part of the government's narrative that the world has changed, and therefore there needs to be extra money to get to 2.5% of GDP being spent on defence, much of that coming from cuts to international aid. If we go on, £2 billion more in investment spending. There was a bit of a theme running through her statement that she is going to invest, put more money into capital spending, because that doesn't break her fiscal rules when it comes to current day-to-day spending. Other things. Additional £2 billion for affordable homes, and that really is housing and planning reform, the centrepiece of where this government thinks they're going to get growth. And again, a bit of good news, the Office for Budget Responsibility said they think they can get to 1.3 million homes by the end of this Parliament, and £600 million to train more construction workers in order to help boost planning reform and those houses that are going to be built, the government hopes. Let's introduce our guests for this part of Politics Live. Joining us here in the studio, Paul Johnson, the Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and with us still Faisal Islam, the BBC's economics editor, and the BBC's political editor, Chris Mason. Welcome to you all. Chris Mason, what did you make of it?
Plenty of what we heard, and you were just summarising the key elements there. We had a reasonable sense of, from what we've heard from those in government over the last week or so. The standout element that we perhaps hadn't anticipated, but goes back to one of the kind of core promises that Labour were making in opposition, and they have made since the general election, is the whole business of building more homes. And, you know, we've talked, haven't we, on Politics Live about what are they called, so-called bananas, build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. I haven't quite managed to come up with a plausible acronym that works, but the kind of thrust of what we were hearing from the Chancellor was kind of build absolutely everything, absolutely anywhere, almost.
Yes.
And putting a huge amount of chips on that. And then, crucially, in terms of the number crunching that goes on today, this whole idea of scoring, to use the Whitehall vernacular. In other words, what does the Office for Budget Responsibility, the independent watchdog / forecaster, what do they believe is plausible when the government presents ideas to them over a 3, 4, 5 year horizon? And crucially, and we've just got hold of the blue book from the OBR, page 68, and a very striking chart where they are accepting that they think it is plausible
to get to 1.3 million, which is still a large amount, but I think the government promised 1.5.
Indeed, and we heard the Chancellor acknowledge that come within a whisker or within touching distance of that promise. Now, if they were able to deliver that, that would be transformative and potentially politically transformative for them. What is interesting here is the OBR suggesting, in their view, that it is possible, and therefore in the accountancy and number crunching and finessing of spreadsheets that goes on a day like this, that really matters in terms of that wider crunching in terms of those numbers that she is now looking at. And you could see the smile across her face, particularly during that particular segment.
Paul Johnson, what struck out for you?
Well, part of what was striking was just the incredible degree of fiscal fine-tuning going on there. They've ended up with precisely the same numbers for headroom for borrowing in 29-30 as they had at the beginning. So they lost 14 billion because of economic changes, and they made up every penny of it to the one decimal
And what does that make you think?
I do wonder whether the sort of target tail is wagging the sort of policy dog here. I mean, was it really necessary to make those small adjustments to the benefit changes just to get it to 9.9 billion of headroom as opposed to 9.5 billion? And the other thing, of course, is that is still a tiny, tiny, tiny amount of headroom. And I guess what really worries me about this is that there's a real chance we're going to have the next 6 months speculating about what tax rises are going to happen in the autumn, because any small negative change in the forecast is going to require some action. There's all sorts of likelihoods of those negative changes. The OBR is looking at its productivity assumptions, for example, and all sorts of things are going on in the world. And we saw between July and October last year just how damaging politically that was for this government, all of that speculation, but it's also genuinely damaging economically. Lots of people, for example, changed their pension arrangements because they were worried the Chancellor might come and raid their pensions. I think they're going to be worried again.
Right. I mean, because I know you have to go fairly shortly, Chris, to go back to the issue, Paul, talking about welfare briefly, that has caused and continues to cause a great deal of discomfort on Labour benches, and they've talked about a moral mission, but it is clear, they were asked to go back and find more savings to make the numbers add up for that precise figure of £9.9 billion of headroom. But in the end, there will be people within the Labour Parliamentary Party who will say, why didn't you make a different choice? Why are the savings all coming from welfare?
Yeah, I think the key thing in the coming hours is to think of today as a sort of play in 3 acts. One was the words out loud we heard from the Chancellor. The other is what the OBR are saying in their book. And the third, and is absolutely key in terms of the human impact of the announcements that we've heard in the last week or so, is this impact assessment coming from the Department for Work and Pensions, imminently if it's not already out. I must admit I've not read it yet if it is out, that breaks down how they anticipate these changes announced last week, and indeed the finessing of those changes announced today.
Because I'm not sure, do we know what the extra changes might be in terms of welfare in order to get that extra amount of money?
We do.
Yes, they're relatively modest tweaks to future incapacity.
There's quite a big change because they're not only halving the incapacity element of universal credit, they're then freezing it for the rest of this Parliament. That's quite a big change, actually.
Right. I mean, that will become clear and clearer to Labour MPs too. And again, they will ask whether different choices could be made. And one of the choices they might say is borrow. You could have borrowed more. Now, Rachel Reeves was at pains to say, I'm very much sticking to my fiscal rules. It's interesting that borrowing is higher this year and next by a bit. Do you think that will have much impact in terms of the markets?
I think they probably anticipated this sort of move. And, of course, we're in the foothills of these sorts of conversations, especially as regards defence spending. The other move in general in terms of the forecast for the economy is much anticipated halving this year down to 1%, but growth is predicted to be higher in the later years, partly as a result of that housing boost. It's interesting, though, that we're talking right now about what was essentially a negotiation with the OBR to recognise existing policy rather than new policy. It's a sort of accounting negotiation. It's important, but they now, where are the actual houses? They're all in bet now, this government, on Bob the Builder.
Right. Well, very conveniently, we have the government's version of Bob the Builder here now. Darren Jones, Chief Secretary to the Treasury. We'll say goodbye to Chris Mason, the BBC's political editor. Thank you very much for joining. Yeah, we tried to rule it out. But do you admit that the figures, the upgrading after a downgrade for this year, that the upgrading of growth is pretty well completely reliant on building those 1.3 million homes?
Well, partly, yeah. I mean, it shows that the...
More than partly,
Well,
Darren.
it shows that the policy decisions that this government is taking will have a positive impact on growth in the economy. That's important because it shows that we are delivering on our growth mission, but for a slightly wonky purpose, it's also really important because the OBR has never done this before. They've never believed governments in the past that they can deliver economic growth. They do believe us because we have credible plans for that delivery. But you're right, we've now got to get on and build, baby, build. Right, well, indeed. They still say it's not 1.5. They say within touching distance, to use Rachel Reeves's words, 1.3 million. How are you going to do it when there is a shortage of construction workers, when there are all sorts of planning problems that exist now? You've still got to get it through politically. How are you going to do it? How did you persuade the OBR, in fact? Well, because they saw all of our plans and believed they were credible, which is what's recognised in the numbers today. You've seen this week our announcement on a construction skills package, £600 million being invested alongside the private sector to train up the bricklayers, the electricians, the carpenters, the engineers that they tell us they need to get building. We're making changes to the planning system to streamline those decisions. That bill was presented to Parliament this week, and we've been really clear through the National Policy Planning Framework and our target setting for local councils that there is no excuse. We've got to get on and build houses. And where we want to build council houses, or social houses as we call them now, we're putting our money where our mouth is with an additional £2 billion already up front to be able to crack on and start building. Paul?
Is this 1.3 million homes? Now, the target is 1.5 million in England, yeah? That 1.3 million is in the UK, so it's not quite as close touching distance as it might sound. I think we're more like 400,000 rather than 200,000 now, is that right?
Probably. Look, we've got to go further. We've set that as a stretching target in the plan for change. That's a very good wonky question there, Paul. But the fact is... Accuracy, is important, as you know. But the fact is we know that was always going to be a stretching target. We've made a huge amount of progress in the last 9 months from where we had started. When house building numbers were at a record low, this is confirmation today through independent checks on what we are saying that we are setting ourselves up for success. But you're right, we've now got to get out there, we've got to give people those jobs, get the spades in the ground and get the homes built. Well, while we've got you here, can you clarify for us, we've just talked about it, but can you clarify for us the changes, the extra changes to welfare to make the savings that were announced today that are different to what Liz Kendall, the Work and Pension Secretary, announced last week? Sure. So the overall package is the same. It's perfectly normal for when government produces these plans for the OBR as the independent check and balance to have a look at it, to kick the tyres, test whether... But they said you were short. They said you were short of the money by £500 million. What has changed? What are the new proposals to bring in or save more money? I'll just say they took a slightly different number. That's perfectly fine as an independent check and balance. It's good that we have that in the system. And so there were two little changes today. One was that the increased rate on universal credit will be to £106 a week, not £107 per week. And also the health top-up for universal credit for new and existing claimants will be frozen until the end of the forecast period. But as I say, it's a normal process for the OBR to check and give us their independent view. They've done that. We've made a few changes as a consequence. But the overall package of supporting people to get into work whilst protecting those who are the most disabled and unable to work is exactly the same. But some disabled people will lose their benefits, will lose the value of it, won't they? I can't talk about individual cases, but what we are doing is making sure that the most severely disabled are protected. People who can't work are supported in those circumstances, but for other people who can work but need access to training or support to be able to do so, we're putting over an additional £1 billion into that system and changing the system to be able to incentivise people to get back to work. For example, with the right to try, where you can go to work and give it a go, and if it doesn't work out because of your additional needs, you can come back onto your original payment without going to the back of the queue. But it is about choices, and we've had a number of questions from people who have written into the BBC, particularly on this issue of a
Labour government's decision to take money out of welfare, out of the pockets of people who are vulnerable and many of them disabled. Why have you made that choice? Because the OBR asking you to find more savings from the welfare budget really underlines that this is all about saving money on the backs of those people, not a moral mission.
No, it's not. It's about helping people who can work and want to work to be in work. It's quite frankly unsustainable that 1,000 people are signing up to additional payments for disabilities every single day, that so many young people are being written off when they come out of school. The evidence is really clear that if they come out of school and they don't get access to training and skills or mental health support where that's required, they get stuck on this system, on the universal credit system, and they don't get the opportunity to fulfil their ambitions. This package of reforms is about, yes, protecting those people who are the most severely disabled and who can't work, but crucially saying to everyone else that we will help you get better, we will give you access to skills and training, and we will help you get a job because we know that that is the best thing for you and your family in the long term.
Right, but in the meantime, some people will lose their benefits and some of those people will probably be some of the poorest and most vulnerable. And the problem with it, a little bit like the tax rises in the October budget, when you said you wouldn't increase the main levers of taxation and business believed you and then you increased national insurance contributions, is people also believed you when, and we're going to hear Rachel Reeves from last year during the election campaign saying there'd be no spending cuts. Let's have a listen.
Austerity under a Labour government. Well, you know, we had austerity for 5 years, and that is part of the reason why our economy and our public services are in a mess today.
But
under Labour, we have got
public spending in some areas.
We're not going to be bringing back austerity, but we have got that immediate injection of cash into our frontline public services.
Do you rule out making cuts to public spending?
I don't want to make any cuts to public spending, which is why we've announced the immediate injection of cash into public services.
But you are taking money out of welfare.
Well, two separate points there. I mean, look, this idea of this austerity thing, I mean, it's just complete nonsense.
Oh.
It's not austerity. We're increasing public spending. I think it's at a total spending level £70 billion higher than the last.
You're going to trim it a bit, though, aren't you? Because you're in charge of the spending review
well,
in June.
we can dive into the detail,
Yeah,
but it's just really important to recognise that this is not austerity. Austerity was blind cuts to the size of the state.
Yes.
We're increasing public spending over this forecast period. We are. We're increasing public spending.
Well, let me ask Paul, I mean, what chance or likelihood is there that there'll be some departments, unprotected departments, that may see what we would broadly call austerity?
Well, I think Darren's clearly right. I mean, the government's increasing spending a lot this year and a fair bit next year, and increasing capital spending. So, you know, by comparison, for example, with the plans that Jeremy Hunt had, this is, you know, extremely generous. But clearly, with growth of 1% a year in the final 3 years of this, or final couple of years of this spending review across public services, it's hard to imagine that won't involve cuts for some bits of current spending over that period. Now, again, that's off a much higher baseline this year than we otherwise would have had, but it'd be very surprising if we don't have some years with some cuts for some departments. Now that, I think Darren's right, is not the same as austerity across the public sector.
No.
But for some bits of it, it will feel quite...
Well, what do you say to that?
Yeah. This whole debate is about how much more money am I going to get, how quickly. It's remarkable that this is the first time in 17 years that government has said, hang on a second, I want to look at how we're spending the £1.2 trillion a year we are already spending. That's why we've made departments go through all of their spending line by line. It's why we're investing up front in our transformation fund to improve productivity in the public sector, reducing the size of the civil service, getting a grip of failure of public services so that those savings can be put back onto the front line. But you can't just keep having an argument about the rate of growth. You've got to make sure you're spending taxpayers' money better now, because people rightly say, well, I'm paying all of this tax and some of my basic public services are not working. It's completely unacceptable. It's right that we get a grip of that.
But there is another choice. I mean, Rachel Reeves said again, I haven't heard it from you yet, the world has changed.
The world has changed.
Yep. And we know the reasons for that. And you've committed to more spending in defence in response to that. But if the world has changed, then why not change the fiscal rules? I mean, there is... Paul is shaking his head. Well, hang on. Paul is shaking his head too, because there have been Labour MPs, the former Cabinet Minister, Lord Blunkett, saying, change the fiscal rules and borrow as a sort of exemption, a special one-off, like they did in 1997. And there will be people watching the programme that say, don't take the money out of welfare, borrow a little bit more, rather than having these arbitrary rules.
Let me just deal with the fiscal rules thing in the same way I dealt with the austerity thing. We've already updated the definition of debt in the fiscal rules at the budget last year. That means that we can invest over £100 billion of additional capital into public services and the economy. That is a good thing, including in defence, by the way. But what this is really a debate about is, are you willing to borrow money each month to pay your day-to-day bills and just keep racking up the debt and then paying enormous amounts of debt interest? We're already spending £105 billion a year on interest on the debt we inherited from the Conservatives. If that was a department in Westminster, it would be the second largest department after the NHS. It's a completely unsustainable path to public finances, and it's not one we're willing to take.
Is that a convincing argument, Paul?
I think it is. I mean, I hate to come to the aid of the government, but, but there we are. Look,
you'll have an opportunity to criticise them in a moment, I'm sure.
These fiscal rules are not very tight. I mean, this government is borrowing an awful lot as it is. It's funding all of that capital spending by borrowing. It actually changed its definition of debt in the last budget to allow it to borrow a great deal more. It's going right up against the limits of those targets, and Darren's absolutely right. This is not borrowing is not a free lunch, and that supposed free lunch has really come back to bite us in the last couple of years, because we are spending so much on debt interest at the moment that borrowing even more. You've got two problems there. One is it's very costly. The other is the Chancellor's made it very clear that she's focused on these rules. We know that the markets are jittery anyway. We have to sell this debt. We are having to sell huge amounts of debt over this year, and to raise that significantly and break those rules, I think, would be seriously risky.
Joe, I want to have another go at this important issue. £5 billion savings in welfare. By my calculations, it's about 1 million people affected. So that's hundreds of thousands of people affected, thousands of pounds. I mean, I know you'll say we're going to help them back into work and all that sort of stuff, but people at home will want to know. It was unclear at the welfare reform Green Paper. Can you just clarify the number of people who are paying that, essentially losing that £5 billion so that you can gain it to the Exchequer? I
think the impact assessment will be published today. I don't have the direct number to hand, I'm afraid, but I think what we're pointing at is the PIP reassessments.
Personal independence
payments. These were payments that are given to people whether they're in work or not, because they have additional needs. The scheme was always designed to support people with the most significant additional needs, but the rate of growth in PIP payments has been unsustainably high. Because of mental health and mainly young people, is that what you're trying to target? Is that what you're trying to unpick? It's part of the problem, but the key thing to your first question is that the PIP system always required that you have to go back to a doctor every so often to see how you're getting on. And since COVID, that has not happened. So we've had this huge growth in the number of people on PIP who are never being supported in the NHS or seen again to see whether we've actually helped them to improve. So the changes that have been announced, we're going to go back to what used to happen pre-COVID, which is where when you get PIP, you get it, but you have to come back and see a doctor every so often to see how you're getting on. But the money you save is coming from somewhere, is the point. And this is a significant amount of money for a tightly defined group of people. It's going to be very visible. I mean, look, the key thing here is that the system was not working in the way that it was designed. It was helping people, it was forcing people to not have the opportunity to work, not have the opportunity to be supported, and being stuck on comparatively low social security payments compared to what you can earn in work. We know that it's better for people with the right help and the right support to be in work, and that's the intention of the policy. Right, and let me introduce Vicky Young, BBC's Deputy Political Editor. Vicky, just before I come to you, we've just had the impact assessment has just dropped. Now, the average loss for someone on the personal independence payment is £4,500 a year. That's significant, Darren. I think so I've not seen the impact assessment because, as you say, it's just been published, but my understanding is what the impact assessment doesn't account for is the benefit that you get from our additional money into support for training, skills or work. So take for example, if I said to my kids, I'm going to cut your pocket money by £10 a week, but you have to go and get a Saturday job, the impact assessment on that basis would say that my kids were down £10, irrespective of how much money they get from their Saturday job. So the impact assessment. Let me just put it. Let me put it a different way. Do you think that is a significant drop in the average amount someone will be able to get on PIP or not? £4,500 a year. The key word there is average. I'm very conscious of the fact that there will be people at home who do receive PIP who I don't want to be unduly worried by an average figure. The key point is that they will be seen by a clinician. The clinician, a qualified clinician, will take the decision as to whether they need the same support they've had or whether they need a different package of support. And those decisions will be taken on a case-by-case basis with those individuals' needs being taken seriously.
Aren't there? A lot of people on PIP are in work.
Yes, and they will be reassessed in the same way for their PIP payments.
I'm going to have to let you go, Darren Jones, Chief Secretary to the Treasury. Thank you very much for joining us. But on that point, Vicky, it's going to be difficult for some Labour MPs to be able to swallow this when they see the amounts. I take Darren's point that it's an average, and there might be other mitigating points, but it is still a loss, a significant loss to many people.
Yeah, it is, and Labour MPs are upset about it. Of course they are. They all went back to their constituencies at the end of last week after the announcement by Liz Kendall, and they've had a lot of people in their constituencies who are worried, who are still going to be worried, as you say, because it's still not entirely clear who this is going to affect, especially if there's some element of reassessment happening. You know, the emails are coming in to Labour MPs, and then they've got to make decisions, of course, of how they react to this. And some of them will be looking at it, and particularly the changes announced today, this extra amount that the government felt it had to find. There are some Labour MPs who are saying, did they really have to do that as well? You know, it's not a huge amount, £500 million in the grand scheme of things, when you're spending, as Darren said, £1.2 trillion. Was it really necessary to put that added change into the freezing, the universal credit health element of it? Was it really necessary to do that? But, you know, Labour MPs are worried. A lot of them didn't expect this. And I think the fact that the government came back for more because the OBR said, look, this isn't saving as much as you thought. For Labour MPs, some of them have said to me, look, that sounds as if you're doing this, obviously, to save money, not because of this sort of broader idea of a reform just to help people get back to work.
Let's get some more reaction. Jim Connolly is in Burnley for us. Over to you, Jim.
Yeah, hi there, Joe. Yeah, Burnley is a particularly interesting place when it comes to benefits, as you've just been talking about there. When it comes to universal credit, it is in the top 10 for the highest proportion of people taking the credit as a benefit. So you can see that all the chat that you've just been having there in the studio has real life consequences here. And interestingly, in Burnley, you would normally on a day like this not hear that much chat about what's going on at Westminster, but stopping, chatting to people, having a bit of food here in the market, the chat around benefit cuts is big. And we've got someone here who is going to face potentially some of that cut. Can you tell us, how do you feel at the minute when it comes to what is being discussed down at Westminster today when it comes to benefits?
Well, I think it's appalling. I'm on the ESA, I'm to change to universal credit, and then all this with PIP. That's just going to, I want me to PIP manage my bills or anything. You know, if I need help off my family, they're not going to be able to come and help me because they're too far away, you know.
And you receive PIP at the minute. Are you concerned that you won't qualify for it going forward?
Yes, I am, because they're making you get 4 points instead of 2 points, which is a lot, really, you know.
We've just heard there that they're talking that this could have an average impact on the average person receiving PIP of a cut of around £4,000 a year. I mean, that is an average, but what would it mean to you somewhere in the region of £4,000 coming out of your income coming in?
Well, I'll just be totally skint. I won't be paying my bills, my housing benefit or anything, you know.
So normally, do you care what's going on at Westminster?
Yes, I listen to it on my mobile every night, you know, and think, get him out, get Keir Starmer out, get somebody right in Parliament.
You feel that strongly about what's happening here?
Get Labour out.
Thanks for the question.
It's really interesting. There is a genuine sense of frustration here when it comes to that issue around benefits. We're hearing it a lot. We've got a couple of people here who are also going to be able to tell us about the effects on the economy and also when it comes to benefits and cuts to things like PIP. We've got Pastor Mick. You're helping people in the local area. Tell me, is the talk around benefit cuts a big thing with the people that you're helping?
It's massive. They're petrified. I think if you start to understand that people on benefits have children, you look at the levels of child poverty in this country and in this town, this is going to decimate this town. The level of affront on the most vulnerable people in society, it doesn't make sense. It makes no sense at all, because poor people don't have much disposable income, so they spend the money and it goes back into the economy. So therefore, why would you withdraw the money that's going to be put back into the economy? It doesn't make any sense. The only notion I can completely understand, which is quite insane, is it all fits and makes sense if you think the government hates working class people. And that's the only way I can come to terms with it. And I hope that's not true, but that's what it looks like.
The government talk about this being about reforming the benefit system and reforming the way people rely on benefits. Do you think that needs to happen so that places like Burnley aren't so heavily reliant on benefits?
I think you'd be better to invest. I think you'd be better to put money into education for young children. I think you'd be better to help young children with mental health issues, the children that never went back to school from COVID, to tackle drug issues, ketamine issues. I think you'd be better to look at healthcare for people that can't access proper healthcare. I think it would be tackling the real problem and looking at the distribution of wealth. So if you take from the poor and not from the rich, what do you think is going to happen? You're going to create more poverty. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing it on a day-to-day basis.
Matthew, you're a local builder.
Yep.
Are you looking today at what the government's saying with some trepidation, or are you excited about what the government's got in store for us all?
Yeah, well, obviously I'm excited about the, is it the 600 million they're going to put into the into colleges. I think that's important. I think that young lads need an incentive into getting into the building game, whether it's brickwork, joinery, plumbing, electrics. I think that they should put more investment into the business side of it, get some business coaches in there, and so they can learn about how to manage money and how to manage the profits and margins, stuff like that.
Burnley is, by statistic, one of the most deprived places in the country. And you chat to people here on the market, and the general feeling is people are feeling, well, frankly, skin. Do you see that yourself? Because you're obviously reliant on those people spending to pay your wages.
Yeah, 100%. I've noticed a massive drop in people inquiring about work. And also, I think that the VAT threshold should be raised to like 150k because from a residential point of view, people can't afford to pay that extra 20%. So just raise the threshold and we'd win more work, and residential customers would be able to afford the work as well.
Mick, we've heard from a number of people here today concerned about the cuts to benefits. It's really interesting because normally what goes on at Westminster is just not the chat around people's kind of cup of tea in a market. But today people are genuinely talking about this. Does that say something?
I think you're talking about sick people who are ill and vulnerable, and we've seen the level of mental health issues off the scale. We're talking about these people. We're talking about people who are severely ill and withdrawing benefit from them, and that creates fear and anxiety. You know exactly what's going to happen when this kicks in. You're going to see more suicides. You're going to see much more child poverty. You're going to see the NHS that's already stretched, absolutely hammered, because these people are going to be turning up at A&E because they're not going to be able to afford and get the care. But it's also the knock-on effects of you take PIP away, you take your eligibility for the discount for the community charge, for poll tax, It has a huge knock-on effect.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. It's really interesting. Often on days at Westminster, you get a real sense that people outside of Westminster aren't really having a conversation about it. But here, today in Burnley, the chat is all about what is happening down at Westminster.
And we can hear that loud and clear, everyone very fully engaged, particularly around the changes to welfare to find the savings that the Office for Budget Responsibility has now said can be found, following Rachel Reeves' statement. Let me introduce Shadow Treasury Minister Gareth Davis, who has just joined us. Just briefly, before we get on to other things, on welfare particularly, do you support the government changes to welfare?
Well, we'll look at the detail of what was announced today and what had to be announced today as part of this emergency budget because of the shortfall scored by the OBR on the previously announced welfare cuts. But the broader principle here is that, yes, we believe that the welfare budget needs to come down.
Even listening to the stories there of people in Burnley about the distress and concern that they have about it.
Of course, you have to have a welfare system that supports the most vulnerable. You do have to support those who are not able to work, and there are many of those. But there are, I'm afraid, lots of people, millions of people, who can work, who often want to work, but have not been able to or not been incentivised to do so. And I think we would support the government's efforts to bring down the welfare budget, just as we set out before the election, and we're making, strong plans, as you know, to do so as well.
Right. I mean, we had your colleague Helen Whately here, the Shadow Work and Pension Secretary, and she said the government should be going further, and you obviously agree with that. In fact, during the election, you said you could find £12 billion, so more than double what the government is suggesting. We've seen that the OBR didn't even think the government initially could save £5 billion. How would you find £12 billion a year?
Well, we set that out before the election. I don't have all the details in front of me.
But do you think it would be even possible, even if you did have all the details, to get more than double what the government is doing on the basis the OBR sent them away to find or make more changes?
Yes, I do, and I think we set out clear policies on that. But you do have to do that in a context of supporting the wider economy, making sure that the economy is growing, making sure that there's job opportunities there for people to go into. And that's where this government, I'm afraid, are falling short as a result of the OBR's assessment today.
Paul Johnson, is £12 billion worth? Were those calculations realistic that the Conservatives are still making and did make in the election?
Well, clearly they're tough to achieve, but this is in the context of spending going up much faster than that. So let's be clear that the savings that the government are making is essentially about spending out less quickly than was previously planned. So there's clearly an issue here, which is that we are spending tens of billions of pounds a year more than we were a few years ago, and that's due to go up by tens of billions of pounds again. And the number of people claiming these benefits has doubled just in the last 4 or 5 years. So it's not surprising that people are, I think, quite rightly looking at making changes.
Right, and that happened under your watch, successive Conservative governments. So who's going to listen to you about making changes to welfare?
It's a fair challenge. We had this little thing called COVID, and as Darren Jones literally sat here was saying, it did balloon after COVID, and we make no apology for that. It was a significant shock to our economy, a shock to people across the country, but we now need to get that down and get people back into work. And as I say, you need a growing economy, you need unemployment to be going down, not up as it's going today. And this is where Labour are falling short, I'm afraid.
Right, and you're calling it an emergency budget. The opposition is widely calling it an emergency budget. Do you not agree that the world has changed?
I think Ukraine was invaded in 2022. You were always managing global factors. That's how you run an economy. Of course, there are things, externalities that you have to manage.
A bit like COVID.
Is overexpose us by completely shooting out your headroom. What you don't do is increase debts, increase spending by 70 billion a year, and impose massive growth-crippling tax rises. That's what happened at the autumn budget. And I'm afraid global factors are of course, in existence, but they've been compounded by her own decisions as Chancellor, and that is what the OBR have made clear today.
Yes, so I think it's worth we're getting new detail now. I mean, normally on a day like today, it's about the Office of Budget Responsibility book, it's about the policy book, but actually this impact assessment from the DWP is very interesting. It's the detail we were missing last week. So 800,000 PIP recipients who would otherwise have got it in 29-30 won't have it. That is 370,000 existing PIP claimants and 430,000 who would have been able to claim it. So that's from the change where 4 points no longer qualify. 150,000 carers benefits then don't get paid as well. And that means an increase in poverty, relative poverty of 250,000. Now, the context is interesting, which is that we will still have growth in the number of people on these benefits. It would have been 1.14 million, but it will be slower. So that is the context. Those are the numbers. And as I said, when we analyse budget measures, often it's they sound bigger, 10 billion, but it's spread over the whole, 20 million people.
800,000 people.
So this is a few thousand people. Now, I think many of the people in Burnley may not be affected. So there's all this extra stress as well about the people who won't be impacted, because it's about this 2.4-point change in the PIP questionnaire.
And there was, as Darren Jones was setting out, there are mitigating amounts of money going in, not just into welfare, but all the NHS and so on and so forth, all explained by the need to increase defence spending. There is also additional money going specifically into defence. And again, this narrative of the world has changed, is that going to convince enough people to support the changes?
Well, I think, look, we talked earlier about Labour MPs who are unhappy about the welfare changes. You will also speak to some who a lot of them went out canvassing at the weekend. They might have local elections going on. We're going into an election period. they will be coming across people on the doorstep who agree with the changes to welfare. So, you know, it is worth making that point that there are people, and, you know, part of the change to these benefits was to try and take away what the government saw as an incentive to claim the health element. You know, I'm too sick to work, I can't look for work, you don't have to fulfil any obligations. So part of the reason behind the change was what they would call a reform, and some of those changes will go down well with some of those on the doorstep, along with the defence spending, because, you know, our news has been dominated, hasn't it, by what's been going on in Ukraine, with the idea that Europe has to do more to look to stand up for itself, and the way that the Chancellor's linking that to the economy and saying, look, we are, I mean, let's face it, being slightly forced into the extra defence spending by Donald Trump. But they were trying to make that into the defence industry becoming, I think she called it, a superpower.
Yes, a defence superpower, industrial superpower, I think was the phrase.
Yeah, I think it's worth talking about this defence spending a little bit. Now, this is getting into the weeds a little bit, but nearly all of the defence spending additional is capital spending. Actually, there's about £500 million more of current day-to-day spending. Now, that's against a £3 billion cut to the overseas development budget in day-to-day spending. So actually what a lot of that day-to-day spending on overseas aid has been cut for hasn't been to support day-to-day spending in defence, it's been to support spending elsewhere or to keep to the fiscal rules. And so I don't think you can argue that within the fiscal envelope that the Chancellor's working to, that a lot of these cuts are down to supporting defence, because it's getting very, very little of additional day-to-day funding. It's all for stuff. It's not for people or the day-to-day funding which is within the envelope.
But you support, of course, the increase, whichever way it's going, into capital spending mainly when it comes to defence.
We want to see more money being spent on defence, yes, absolutely, in a very troubled world.
And how would you pay for it then? Because we know from Kemi Badenoch, the Conservative leader, she said recently, when we were in government, when she was in cabinet, they wanted to increase spending as a proportion of GDP to 3%, but they couldn't make the figures. The numbers add up.
Well, we set out very clearly that we would cut the civil service back to pre-pandemic levels, and that in large part would help pay for the defence uplift. And we are now in a situation where we may need to go further than what we previously had said, and we would need to get back into government, open the books and see how we could spend that. But you do need a context, again, of a growing economy. I'm afraid I keep coming back to this because it is vital.
Yes, but they've just had the forecasts upgraded from 2026 onwards.
I'm afraid growth has been cut in half for this year as a result of the massive tax rises.
And then what happens in 2026?
Budget. It goes back to what it was forecast in March 2024 when we had a budget. Jeremy and I put forward a budget in March 2024. So for a government who has as their central #1 mission growth, which is a good thing, they're going back to where we were in March 2024, according to what I've seen in the OBR forecasts.
You're now quite attached to a weak economy as part of your political messaging in a way. That might change. I mean, there's small signs in some of the service sector activity data that things may be beginning to pick up. The government may get a deal with the US, may improve trade conditions with the EU. You know, if suddenly we get normal growth again, as the ABR is predicting of 2-ish%, you're going to be slightly beached.
No, we're not. We'll welcome anything that's positive for the country, because we want the country to grow. We want the economy to grow. We need it to grow so that we can pay for things like national defence. Of course we do. The trouble is the action of this government so far is anti-growth. The planning reforms, of course, are absolutely welcome. And
why didn't you do them?
Well, maybe we should, but we lost the election. But these guys won on a mandate of change and to grow the economy. And what these figures show, I'm afraid, is that if inflation is up, growth is down by cut in half this year. And over the period, it's back to where we were forecast to grow the economy. So it's not exactly I'm not sure if I was Darren Jones or Rachel Reeves, I'd be high-fiving everybody right now.
Gareth Davis, thank you very much for joining us. You mentioned tax in terms of there may be the chance of having to increase taxes in the autumn. There has been some discussion about the unfreezing of the tax thresholds that Rachel Reeves announced was going to happen a bit earlier in the autumn budget. Would that be one way of refreezing them, of getting the sort of tax and the amounts of money that she needs or might need?
Well, she didn't actually unfreeze them. She just didn't extend
Yes.
the period for which they will be frozen. I think the real risk here is that we'll get a rerun of the period up to the last budget, when everyone was speculating about what is the tax rise going to be. Now, I don't know that there'll need to be tax increases, but she's left herself with exactly the same tiny bit of room for manoeuvre against her ironclad fiscal rules. And when you've got a tiny bit of room for manoeuvre and you're counting those fiscal rules as ironclad, and we'll be past the spending review by then, you've really only got tax to go to. And we know how uncertain the world is. There's a not far off 50-50 shot that she'll lose that fiscal room. So there's a 50-50 shot she'll need to make some tax rises, nearly 50-50. And it might be that those need to be quite big again. And if we're all worrying about, well, what is she going to come and raid my pension? Is she going to come and put up corporation tax? Is she going to impose a wealth tax? That affects people's behaviour, it affects people's confidence. So I think it's going to be quite difficult for the politics for the government. I think it actually genuinely has a negative effect on the economy as well.
Paul Johnson from the IFS, thank you very much for joining us. Just sticking with tax briefly, because we're going to speak to the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Ed Davey, and he brought up this issue of the digital services tax on tech companies, because there's certainly been some discussion. It's 2%, it's levied on companies, brings in £800 million. That could go to appease Donald Trump in any negotiations, that they'd like an exemption on steel tariffs or any sort of trade deal that may or may not happen. What are you hearing, Faisal?
So it's 800 million now, and it rises close to $1 billion a year by the end. And certainly they've been very public, the US authorities, in saying, we don't like these things, they should go, they're an imposition on our sovereignty. It's not so much the money, they can probably stomach the loss of £1 billion in tax revenue, but it's the fact that it happened in France, it happened here in the UK, and now it's been copied all around the world. They call it a contagion. They want to stop the contagion, and we're better than the sort of source of one of these ideas, which is in the UK. It will be a big win for them if we abandon in any way the DST. The mood music I'm hearing is that it is being talked about.
Right.
There could be a deal in the coming days. In fact, there'd have to be to offset the Liberation Day, which is next Tuesday or Wednesday, I think. So that could be on the table. Other things too. Because, you know, it's not a full trade deal. We won't be talking about farm produce. No. We presume we won't be talking about the NHS, which was on, you know, there was some
discussion about that
pharmaceutical pricing and the like. It'll mainly be about tech and AI. And so in that regard, it's a small amount.
Yes.
But I think the optics are intriguing, shall we say, of giving a tax cut to big tech-based multinationals based in the US. At the same time, we heard from Burnley, as there will be some pain for those people currently in receipt of PIP and an increase in poverty.
Well, let's talk to Ed Davey, the leader of the Liberal Democrats. Hello to you, Ed. I hope you could hear that last bit of the conversation on the digital services tax, because you raised it at Prime Minister's questions with Keir Starmer. He didn't exactly rule it out, did he?
No, he actually didn't answer my question. And the idea that we should get rid of this tax to appease Elon Musk because he's squatting in the Oval House with President Trump is quite wrong.
So it's just about the person, not because of the tax or the sort of finances of it. It's because you don't like Elon Musk.
No, not at all. This raises significant monies. It could be raised more, we believe, to raise more money off social media giants who are making huge profits. And let's remember, there's increasing evidence that some of these social media giants are responsible for some social harm. And we deal with that with legislation, online safety legislation, but also this tax we can help people. So, Liberal Democrats raised this in the general election. It's not new for us. No. And that was before President Trump was elected.
Right. I mean, if you agree broadly with the government, though, that the world has changed, we've still got the ongoing war. We now have Donald Trump in the White House. He's been there for a little while, and we don't quite know how the tariff policy is going to unfold in full. What should the reaction be from the government? Should the government, in terms of raising the money to go into defence, should they be tougher on spending, or tilt further towards the European response of increased borrowing?
Well, we've actually argued for a fully funded increase in defence spending with things like increasing the digital services tax, and we've argued we should also work with our Europeans. We've put forward the idea of a European rearmament bank that could lend to industry, to the private sector, so we could increase the defence manufacturing capability here in the UK and across Europe. We've got to invest in defence, and Liberal Democrats have argued fully for that. But I don't think we can let Rachel Reeves off totally. Yes, she inherited a dreadful economy from the Conservatives, and yes, things like tariffs and the trade situation has changed because of Donald Trump, but she's made mistakes as well. I think her budget with the job tax has really hit small business and undermined the prospects of growth. And to go back to your point about European colleagues, that they just have been almost non-existent at negotiating and opening negotiations with our European friends to tear down the awful trade barriers that the Conservatives put up that have stymied growth. So Liberal Democrats want to do that, get a new EU-UK customs union deal so we can really boost growth. That would make a much bigger difference than anything this government's put forward.
Right. In terms of the government's welfare cuts and savings that we have been discussing, you called them alarming, really alarming. Does that mean that you are comfortable with 9.2 million people who are economically inactive?
No, not at all. We've put forward ideas about how you would help people who are currently not in work into work, particularly young people. So on that overall analysis, we agree. The question, though, is how you do it. And if you look at the people who are economically inactive, some of them are waiting for treatment on the NHS, and the government's not moving fast enough on that.
Well, although waiting lists have come down, haven't they, David, because of the money that's gone into the NHS?
Sure, and I welcome that, but I still don't think they're going fast enough. And then I would point to carers. I know a lot about this from my own personal circumstances, and having talked to many carers across our country. Many of them are juggling work and care. If we supported that better, reformed the carers allowance rather than taking away from people, actually you find more people back into work. So there are other things you can do. Rather than penalising people, supporting people into work, which we really need to do. But, I heard Faisal talking about some of the figures that we're now seeing. 800,000 people not getting a PIP by the end of this period, with a knock-on effect to 150,000 carers losing allowance. I mean, I actually think this could be counterproductive.
Right, but it's interesting, Ed Davey, because if we go back to the years of the coalition, and you sat round that cabinet table and signed off huge cuts to welfare outlined by the then Chancellor George Osborne. So you obviously thought money could be found then from the welfare budget.
I hope you don't mind me correcting you, but the big welfare cuts came after the coalition in George Osborne's budget of 2015, when he cut welfare spending by £12 billion a year. He tried to do that in the coalition. We'd stopped him.
Right. I mean, it does say this is the IFS, their figures, 2010 to 2015, welfare cuts were £22 billion in 2018-19 prices.
There were some changes, absolutely.
But huge amount.
What?
22 billion?
Over the lifetime of that government. And then George Osborne comes in and 12 billion cuts, which he'd been trying to make, which we stopped.
Sure, but the point I'm trying to make here is that you, when in government, you also thought, along with the Conservatives, that there was money that could be taken out of welfare.
Yeah, and I'm saying that now in the sense of we still want people to get back into work. And one of the things we did in the coalition, very much a Liberal Democrat success, was to increase the tax allowance to make it more financially beneficial to go to work, increase the incentive to go to work, and take the low paid out of tax. What's happened since? Well, the Conservatives have reversed that by freezing them, and then Labour's continuing that. So
right, so you don't see any contradiction. You don't see any contradiction with criticising the government now for making nearly £5 billion worth of savings and £22 billion then.
We're doing things, the government's doing things that we wouldn't do. They're doing things on top of things that George Osborne, the Tories, did later, much more severe cuts. So I think you have to see these in context. The situation is far worse now, and they're about to make it much more worse.
Ed Davey, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, thank you very much for joining us today on Politics Live. Ed Davey there in Central Lobby in the Houses of Parliament. Let's get some more reaction from other opposition parties. Christian Fraser, my colleague, is on College Green. Over to you, Christian.
Yes, a beautiful day here on College Green, Joe. If only the sun was shining in quite the same way on the UK economy. With me is Richard Tice, the Deputy Leader of Reform UK. We've also got with us Ellie Chowns from North Herefordshire, the MP for North Herefordshire. She's also the spokesman for the Greens Housing and Committee. And also we've got Stephen Flynn, the Westminster Leader for the SNP. Welcome to you all. Richard Tice, let me start with you. Are you in favour or are you against the cuts to welfare?
Well, this budget is an absolute disaster. There will be no cuts to welfare because they'll just kick it into the long grass because they don't want to vote amongst Labour MPs. But the summary for this spring statement is delusional. The OBR, I think it must have been eating some magic mushrooms or something. The idea that you can halve your growth forecast this year and suddenly magic up a whole load of extra growth in subsequent years when the Chancellor's saying it's all due to geopolitical global factors. You can't have it both ways. It's a complete contradiction in terms. We're heading towards the R word.
So where would you
of
find
recession.
the servings? Would you cut welfare?
What you've got to cut is scrap net stupid zero, stop paying voluntary interest on from the Bank of England on the printed money, and you've got to cut wasteful spending, which actually, in fairness, that Darren Jones has talked about. The question is, will they actually deliver it? I doubt it.
You've not answered the question. No.
Welfare, the welfare budget, welfare is completely out of control. There are far too many people who are claiming welfare who actually should be working, can be working, and we need to encourage them to work. At the moment, for too many people, the calculation at the end of the week is it doesn't pay me to go to work. You've got to make work pay.
So you'd go further?
Way further. This government won't go anywhere because this is just, it's all talk.
Stephen Flynn, we heard you ask a question of the Prime Minister this afternoon. 55% of children, you said, are living in poverty in Scotland. But the bill for welfare in this country is projected to reach 100 billion by 2030. So how would you reform it?
So the point I was actually making in the chamber was that 55% of children living in poverty in Scotland do so with a disabled adult within the house, which is a slightly different thing. And based upon the Chancellor's announcement today, as I understand it, there's going to be another 50,000 children who are going to be pushed into poverty. Of a total, 250,000 people are going to be pushed into poverty as a result of the choices the Chancellor has made here today. You know, she spoke a lot about the fact that the world has changed, but the only thing that's changed in my eyes is the Labour Party. It once stood for something. It once stood for working people. It once stood for aspiration. It once stood for protecting people. And instead, what the Chancellor has done today is outline a new era of austerity. The only people that are clapping her on are the Tories, the likes of George Osborne in days gone by, who would have lapped up this sort of thing. This isn't what the Labour Party were elected to do. It's the exact antithesis of that. And the consequences for them are going to come home to roost in the Scottish Parliament election next year, when they are, of course, going to lose to the Scottish National Party.
So where would you find the savings?
So when it comes to the UK economy, I don't think anyone can be in any doubt that it is in a dire place. We see growth downgrading, we see inflation going up. But the one thing that Richard didn't mention, and the Chancellor didn't mention either, is Brexit and the enormous impact that's having upon the UK economy. If you want to grow the economy, you have to align yourself with your biggest trading partners in the European Union, single market access customs union. What you also need to do is look at your own fiscal rules. Look at what's happening in Germany, where they've changed the constitution to borrow more in order to ensure that they have the defence capabilities available. The UK Chancellor, she has boxed herself in on tax, on fiscal rules and on her position in relation to the European Union, and we're all experiencing the damage of that. But the people who are experiencing that pain the most are going to be disabled people, and that is the legacy of this Labour government.
And the point is, Ellie Chance, it is a political decision. These are her fiscal rules.
Absolutely, it's a political choice, and she could make different political choices. Instead of balancing the books on the backs of the poorest and the disabled, she could make the choice to increase taxes on the very wealthy in society. A 2% tax on assets over £10 million would generate about £24 billion. Equalising tax on investment income to tax on earned income would raise about £12 billion. These are huge sums of money. So why isn't the Chancellor making those choices? Those would be the right choices, the fair choices, and they would generate sufficient revenue to invest in the transformation that our country does need.
You're the spokeswoman for housing and communities. There's a whole element within this statement that is to do with building more homes, 1.3 billion more homes, which is part of the growth that she says she can restore. That equates to around 400,000 homes a year. We've never built in the last 10 years more than 250,000.
We absolutely do need to build more homes. I spoke in the debate on the Planning and Infrastructure Bill on Monday, and I made the point there. We need to build new homes, but they've got to be the right ones at the right price. They've got to be affordable and in the right place. But also, we've got to tackle the scandal of completely inequitable home ownership. There are nearly 1 million homes empty in the UK. Tackling the housing crisis has got to be broader than just building. And the other thing is, as Rachel Reeves said in the Chamber today, there's building that is being unlocked through changes to planning. We need to look at the detail of that, but also we do need far more investment. Government has a huge and positive role to play in priming investment in more social housing, and the government just isn't doing that. And that's what I find so disappointing about this statement today. You know, there was no mention of investment in housing, in transport, in tackling the climate crisis. We need to be a green industrial superpower. The government, the Chancellor, has the opportunity to do this. I want her to grasp
plenty
the
on
nettle.
defence, which she said would be good for Scotland. Are you in favour of that?
I think all of us want to see the defence budget increased. It's how you increase that budget that matters. What the Chancellor has chosen to do is take away from the international aid budget, which actually causes us a greater level of risk, because that takes money and investment away from areas of the world where other nations, like China, like Russia, are going to step in. So in order to invest in our own domestic defence, we need to follow the likes of Germany and go from there. But you don't need to take my word for this, you don't take Ellie's word for this either. Look at the faces of the Labour politicians in the House of Commons, glum and gloom, because they know this is not the Labour Party they expected to be a part of.
So you're not happy that even though you're creating Scottish jobs in defence, you're not happy that that money has to come from international development?
Oh, absolutely not, because it makes us less safe by allowing the likes of China and Russia, forces of very great danger to us, to allow to step into those developing countries where we should be there with the United States, making sure that we're protecting those communities. That's why we need to look at the likes of Germany with what they've done with their defence package. And there's no talk of that in this place. And as I say, all you have to do is look at the faces of those Labour politicians, because they know this is not the Labour Party they thought they were going to be a part of.
Well, we'll certainly speak to some of those Labour politicians through the course of the afternoon. Stephen Flynn, Ellie Chance and Richard Tice, who had to duck away a little early. Thank you very much indeed for your time. We'll hand you back to Jo in the studio.
Yes, thank you very much, Christian. Leave you there in the sunshine. Let's just remind our viewers of the measures that we heard from Rachel Reeves in her spring statement summary. Starting off, the fiscal headroom of £9.9 billion, her room for manoeuvrability, she says, has been restored, or will be by 2029-30, after being wiped out. No further tax increases in the statement. We weren't expecting them, but we've just had a discussion. There might be some later on in the year. Economic growth halved in terms of a forecast to 1% this year. But good news for Rachel Reeves, growth upgraded from 2026 onwards. Public spending, Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, forecast will be down by £6.1 billion with efficiencies and savings in 2029-30 being made to Whitehall. She went on to say that the £4.8 billion of cuts to welfare spending have been reached with the changes announced, and an extra £2.2 billion of defence spending next year to reflect the ongoing challenges, and £2 billion more in investment spending, that to encourage more investment and growth, an additional £2 billion for affordable homes. Again, that is what they're relying on, the house building programme boosting growth, and £600 million to train more construction workers, which they will need if they are going to hit that target of 1.5 million homes that they have made. The OBR have said they can see it reaching 1.3 million homes, but as Paul Johnson was pointing out, that is across the UK, I think, and not just for England. Let's talk about the house building. Because it was certainly the centrepiece of the election campaign and beyond, and the budget last year. We haven't seen any huge signs or evidence of it getting underway, although there was a note of congratulations and thanks to Angela Rayner, for whom it's her department. How much is reliant on this really taking off right now, Vicky?
Well, it's a thank you in advance, isn't it?
Yeah.
Hoping that it will materialise. And I think the problem is you have got an electorate who have heard this many times before about the number of houses. Now, there is a big difference. They have changed the planning laws. So, you know, they are expecting, and it's there on the, you know, the OBR costings, that it will work. And I think, you know, if it happens, these will be real results. They will change people's lives.
Yeah. It'll be transformative.
Will be something very tangible for people. It could create jobs if you can train those people up in time. So if it happens, it's a tangible win for the government by the next election, potentially, along with other building projects which might get started by then, expansion of airports and all the rest of it. But again, it feels a little bit long-term, doesn't it? But I think for now, you get the impression that Rachel Reeves is taking it as a win, isn't she?
Well, but the Office for Budget Responsibility believe her.
Yes, this is kind of like a spreadsheet win. They persuaded the OBR.
That sounds less exciting.
Well, I mean,
the first stage.
A lot of effort seems to have gone into persuading them to score this. And it's something, just because it didn't score in the past, doesn't mean it isn't a sensible thing to do in terms of the economy.
They're putting an enormous amount of effort into doing it and achieving it.
And, but at the end of it, so what the OBR say is that they can see the pathway towards getting 300,000 homes per year by the end of the Parliament. You know, that's pretty impressive. That's the highest we've seen, I think, in 40 years.
Yes.
And that would make a tangible difference. And that would be pretty much on course. I think, you know, let's see the detail in terms of the target. But it's not people carrying hods of bricks and like building, and even some of these houses, probably, you know, most of them, I'm going to guess, aren't even in the planning system yet. And we've had some doubts from the actual private sector building companies about whether they can do this. But I guess what comes with this is total commitment to try and deliver on the policy. I think if you look at the details and the nerdy detail of why the OBR say that they think this can happen now, it's about the freeing up of land from local government. Okay. We've got local elections coming in May.
And that has been a big block, hasn't it?
Well, you know, it's not a passive reality in Britain that houses don't get built. It's the result of what happens in local council planning authorities, where people put their hand up and vote no to house building. And they vote no not because they hate housing, but because that is the revealed preference of people in their area. They don't want houses. For that to change, that is a huge political change that will have to be painful.
It is about delivery. And the government have, arguably, some time. They have a big majority. If they can deliver on this centrepiece, and if they can deliver on growth, I know there are a lot of ifs, but they are setting the groundwork. Right now, I'm being told in the House of Commons in the debate, Labour MPs are expressing their unhappiness and concern about these welfare changes.
Yeah, I was just about to mention that, because what we're talking about there are the wins for Rachel Reeves. They seem to feel quite long-term. So if it's defence, if that's going to somehow boost the defence industry, bring in jobs, housing, that might also boost the economy. The problem is that the things she's had to do now are what you might argue are the painful things. So we've had Debbie Abrahams, for example, who's the chair of the Select Committee on Work and Pensions, saying this is about making increased poverty, worsening health. How will making people sicker and poorer help drive up the economy and people into jobs? And that's just a reflection of quite a few Labour MPs.
Well, and we will no doubt be discussing this amongst other things and digesting even more the contents of this spring statement. Thank you to both of you for keeping me company today, and all of those watching. I'll be back tomorrow with more Politics Live at 12:15. Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.